In the soft light before the monsoon rain swept in, a young Burmese teacher named Thant folded a letter he had written to his sister in the northern hills and pressed it against his chest, feeling the paper grow warm against his skin as if it could somehow carry the weight of everything he could not yet say aloud. He stood on the wooden veranda of his family home just outside a small town along the Irrawaddy, watching the river slide past like a slow, brown ribbon that had seen empires come and go. The air smelled of wet earth and frangipani, the same scent that had wrapped around his childhood, yet something in the breeze felt different now, sharper, as though the world beyond the trees was leaning closer. Thant had spent years teaching his students about their own history, about the quiet pride of their people, but lately the lessons felt heavier. His students asked questions he could not answer with the old certainties. Would their land remain theirs? Would the British who had ruled for so long simply hand it over one day, or would something far more violent decide the matter? He folded the letter again and slipped it into his pocket, then walked down the path toward the road where the trucks rumbled past day and night, carrying supplies that never seemed to stop. Those trucks belonged to the Burma Road, the twisting lifeline that climbed from the port of Rangoon up through the hills and into China. For the people who lived beside it, the road was both blessing and burden. It brought work for drivers and loaders, money for families who had little, and news from distant places that arrived in crumpled newspapers or shouted radio bulletins. But it also brought the knowledge that their quiet corner of the world had become important to men in faraway capitals who had never walked its muddy tracks or tasted its dust. Thant sometimes stopped to watch the convoys, the Chinese drivers with tired eyes and the Indian soldiers who guarded them, and he wondered what it felt like to carry the fate of nations on your back while your own heart longed only for home. One of those soldiers was Sergeant Rajit Singh, a man from a small village in Punjab who had been posted to Burma 2 years earlier. He wrote letters to his wife every Sunday, sitting on the edge of his cot with a small wooden box balanced on his knees. In the latest one he described the way the morning mist clung to the hills like a second skin, how the local children sometimes brought him mangoes and laughed when he tried to speak their language. He never wrote about the ache in his chest when he thought of his newborn son, a child he had never held. Instead he told her about the kindness of a Burmese woman who had mended his torn uniform without being asked, and how that simple act had made the barracks feel less like a cage and more like a place where human beings still recognized one another. Sergeant Singh had joined the army because it promised steady pay and a chance to see the world, but lately the world felt too large and too dangerous. He had heard the rumors drifting up from the south, stories of Japanese forces moving through Thailand, and though he tried to push the worry aside, it returned each night when the lights went out and the jumble sounds pressed against the thin walls. Farther south, in a modest bungalow shaded by tall trees in Rangoon, Margaret Harrington sat at her writing desk and reread a letter from her sister in England. The paper carried the faint scent of lavender from home, a scent that now felt impossibly distant. Margaret's husband, a district officer who had served in Burma for nearly 15 years, moved through the house with the careful politeness of a man who sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. They spoke little of politics at the dinner table, but Margaret noticed how he lingered over the radio each evening, listening for any hint of trouble from across the border. She had grown to love the rhythm of life here, the way neighbors shared fruit from their gardens and the way the river markets came alive at dusk. Yet she also felt the undercurrent of resentment that ran through conversations she was not meant to overhear. The Burmese wanted their country back. The British wanted to keep what they had built. And somewhere in between, ordinary families tried to raise their children, pay their debts, and hold on to the small dignities that made life bearable. Margaret had begun keeping a small journal, not of events but of moments, the sound of her cook humming while chopping vegetables, the way her husband's hand trembled slightly when he lit his pipe after hearing bad news from Malaya. She did not know how to name the feeling that grew inside her, but it felt like standing on a bridge while the river rose. Along the Burma Road itself, a driver named Mong spent his days guiding his battered truck up and down the endless switchbacks. He was not a soldier and not a politician, yet the road had become his entire life. He knew every curve where the tires slipped in the rain, every tea stall where the owners saved the strongest brew for drivers who looked ready to fall asleep at the wheel. Mong carried crates of medicine, drums of fuel, and sometimes letters from Chinese families to relatives who had fled years earlier. He had seen the faces of the men who loaded his truck in Rangoon, faces that carried the exhaustion of a war already being fought hundreds of miles away. Once, after a long night drive, he had stopped to help a stranded Chinese convoy whose lead truck had broken an axle. Together they worked in the rain until the wheel was free, and when they finished, one of the Chinese drivers pressed a small carved wooden fish into Mong's hand. For luck, the man had said. Mong still carried it in his pocket. He did not speak of the growing fear that one day the road would be blocked not by mud or broken engines but by soldiers who would not let anyone pass. Instead, he focused on the next bend, the next cup of tea, the next small kindness that kept the world from feeling completely broken. These separate lives were connected by something larger than any of them could fully see. The Burma Road existed because China was still fighting Japan, and the supplies that traveled its length helped keep that fight alive. For the people of Burma, that fact arrived not as a headline but as the sound of engines at all hours, as soldiers who spoke different languages, as the quiet knowledge that their home had become a corridor between distant powers. Thant felt it when he taught his students about self-rule and saw the hope and fear mix in their eyes. Sergeant Singh felt it when he wrote to his wife and realized he might be asked to defend a land that was not his own against an enemy he had never chosen. Margaret Harrington felt it in the lengthening silences at her dinner table. Mong felt it in the weight of every crate he hauled and the growing certainty that the road itself might soon become a front line. One evening Thant walked to a small gathering of friends and former students who met in a teak house on the edge of town. They spoke in low voices about the future, about whether the British would ever leave without a fight, about what the Japanese might bring if they came. One young man read aloud from a newspaper smuggled from Rangoon, his voice steady even as the words described Japanese advances farther south. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then an older woman who had lost her husband years earlier stood and poured tea for everyone, her hand steady. "Whatever comes," she said quietly, "we will still need to eat, still need to care for our children, still need to remember who we are." The simple act of pouring tea in the face of uncertainty stayed with Thant long after he walked home. It was the same quiet courage he saw in Sergeant Singh's letters home, in Margaret's careful journal entries, and Mong's determination to keep driving no matter how heavy the load. These were not soldiers yet. They were teachers and drivers, wives and district officers, people whose greatest battles so far had been fought in classrooms, on muddy roads, and inside their own hearts. They carried the ordinary hopes of ordinary lives, hopes for safety, for dignity, for a future in which their children might inherit something better than fear. And yet each of them sensed, in different ways, that the world was tilting toward a test none of them had chosen. The monsoon would come again, as it always did, but this year the rains might fall on a different Burma, one where the sound of trucks on the road would be joined by the sound of something far more final. If the quiet courage of people like Thant and Sergeant Singh, of Margaret and Mong, moves you as deeply as it moves me, then perhaps you would like to hold a tangible piece of that story close. There are hand-picked World War II memorabilia and thoughtful books about the China-Burma-India theater available through Amazon, along with the powerful film Midway streaming on Prime Video, each one a way to honor the courage of all who stood on the edge of history in the fight across the Asian theater. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Thant returned to his veranda that night and stood for a long time listening to the river. Somewhere in the darkness a truck engine coughed and started again, heading north toward the hills. He thought of his sister reading his letter, of Sergeant Singh writing to his wife, of Margaret's journal filling with small moments that might one day matter more than anyone could guess. The night was still warm, still scented with frangipani, yet the air seemed to carry a new question. When the storm finally broke, would they be ready? Would any of them? The road stretched on into the darkness, and for now the only answer was the steady sound of engines carrying whatever the future required, 1 mile at a time. The jungle did not announce the war with any warning a man could prepare for. It simply opened its green mouth and swallowed the first Japanese patrols, and for Sergeant Rajit Singh, standing in a clearing that had felt safe only an hour earlier, the world he had written about to his wife that morning disappeared between one breath and the next. He had been checking the perimeter wire with 2 young sepoys when the first shots came, not from the road they had been told to watch, but from the trees behind them. The sound was wrong, too close, too sharp, like branches snapping inside his own chest. Singh dropped to one knee, hard hammering against his ribs, and for a terrible second he could not remember how to load his rifle. One of the young men beside him cried out, a short, surprised sound that ended in a wet cough. Singh crawled to him through the wet leaves, the smell of blood and crushed vegetation mixing until he could not tell which was which. The boy's eyes were wide and frightened, and Singh found himself whispering the same words he used when his own son cried in the night back home, words that had no place in this sudden hell. He pressed his hand over the wound and felt the warmth leaking between his fingers, and in that moment he understood that the quiet life he had described in his letters was already gone. Farther south, where the border with Thailand blurred into thick forest, Private Kenji Tanaka moved with the rest of his company along a narrow trail that maps had not bothered to name. He had fought in China and then in Malaya, and each victory had taught him the same lesson: the enemy who stayed on the roads would always lose to the enemy who learned to live in the spaces between them. Tanaka's uniform was already soaked through, his boots heavy with mud, yet he felt a fierce, private pride as he slipped past another abandoned Allied position. The British and Indians had built their defenses facing the main tracks, exactly as they had been trained to do in other wars. They had not understood that in this country the jungle itself was the road. Tanaka thought of his younger brother back in the village near Osaka, the one who had written asking what it felt like to be part of something that would change Asia forever. He had not answered yet. Now, with the first shots echoing ahead of him, he wondered if any letter could ever explain the strange mix of excitement and dread that filled a man when he realized the enemy was already behind him. Back in the clearing, Sergeant Singh finally managed to drag the wounded sepoy into a shallow dip in the ground. The other young soldier had vanished into the trees, either dead or running, Singh could not tell. He tore strips from his own shirt to bind the wound, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie the knots. The boy kept whispering his mother's name. Singh wanted to tell him that help was coming, that the company would counterattack and drive the Japanese back into the forest they had come from, but the words felt like lies even as he thought them. This was not the war he had imagined when he enlisted for steady pay and the chance to see distant places. This was something older and meaner, something that used the trees as weapons and turned every shadow into a possible grave. He thought of the letter he had started that morning, the one that still sat half-finished on his cot, and he felt a sharp, physical grief for the words he would never finish writing. In a small town not far from the advancing front, Thant stood among a crowd of neighbors watching Japanese soldiers move along the main street with the calm efficiency of men who already considered the place theirs. He had heard the distant firing since dawn, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of these foreign troops walking past the tea shop where he had drunk tea every morning for 10 years. Some of the soldiers smiled and nodded at the watching civilians, gestures that felt almost polite. Others kept their eyes on the tree line, rifles ready. Thant felt a complicated knot tighten in his chest. For years he had spoken with friends about the end of British rule, about the day when Burmese voices would finally decide their own future. Now that day seemed to be arriving in the form of these quiet, battle-hardened men from across the sea, and he could not tell whether what he felt was hope or a new kind of fear. An older woman beside him began to cry softly, not loudly, just a steady, private weeping. Thant reached out without thinking and took her hand. She squeezed his fingers once, hard, then let go. In that small, wordless exchange he understood that whatever came next, the people of this town would still have to find ways to care for one another. The shock of those first hours spread outward like ripples in dark water. Allied pilots who had been told the Japanese Air Force was second-rate found themselves scrambling into the sky against planes that moved with terrifying speed and precision. One young flight lieutenant named James had been drinking tea in the mess when the alarm sounded. He ran to his aircraft with his boots unlaced, heart already racing from the stories that had reached them from Malaya. In the air he discovered that the old rules of engagement meant nothing here. The enemy appeared from the sun, vanished into cloud, reappeared from directions no one had expected. James watched a friend's plane burst into flame and spiral toward the green canopy below, and he felt something inside himself go very still and very cold. He kept flying because there was nothing else to do, but the easy confidence he had carried since training was gone, replaced by a raw, animal awareness that death could come from any angle in this sky. On the ground, the Japanese advantage grew with every hour. Their soldiers moved in small groups, carrying only what they needed, eating what the jungle or captured supplies could provide. They bypassed strongpoints and appeared hours later in the rear, cutting telephone lines, ambushing supply columns, turning the confident map of Allied defenses into a confusing web of isolated pockets. Sergeant Singh experienced this firsthand when he finally reached what he thought was safety, only to find Japanese troops already occupying the next ridge. He spent the rest of that day and the night that followed moving from one patch of cover to another with the wounded sepoy on his back, stopping every few minutes to listen for voices that did not belong to his own side. The jungle that had once seemed merely hot and wet now felt alive and hostile, every leaf potentially hiding a rifle, every sound a possible betrayal. Yet in the middle of that terror he also found small, stubborn acts of humanity. At one point he came across 2 Indian soldiers from another unit who had stayed behind to help a wounded British officer. They shared the last of their water without being asked. No one spoke of medals or duty. They simply did what was necessary because the alternative was to let another human being die alone in the green darkness. Private Tanaka, meanwhile, experienced the other side of the same hours. His company had achieved its objectives quickly, yet the cost was already visible in the faces of men who had marched for days with little sleep. One of his friends had been killed by a stray bullet during the first clash, a stupid, random death that left Tanaka staring at the body longer than he should have. He kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that this jumble did not care which flag a man carried. When his unit paused near a small village, Tanaka saw a Burmese farmer standing in a doorway, watching them with an expression that was neither welcome nor open hatred, only a deep, weary caution. Tanaka nodded once, a small gesture that cost nothing. The farmer nodded back. For a moment the war felt almost ordinary, 2 tired men acknowledging each other across a line neither had drawn. Then the order came to move again, and Tanaka stepped back into the trees, the moment already fading into memory. The speed of the advance created its own kind of cruelty. Men who had trained for set-piece battles found themselves fighting for survival in conditions no training manual had described. The jungle magnified every mistake. A patrol that lost its way could wander for hours in circles. A unit that ran low on water discovered that the nearest stream might already be in enemy hands. Sergeant Singh felt this when he finally reached a small Allied position that was supposed to be a rallying point, only to learn that the men there had received no orders for 2 days and were surviving on rumor and dwindling rations. He sat with his back against a tree, the wounded sepoy sleeping fitfully beside him, and wrote the rest of his letter to his wife by the light of a shielded lantern. He did not write about the fear or the blood. He wrote about the way the light filtered through the leaves in the late afternoon, how it reminded him of the fields near his village at harvest time. He wrote that he loved her and that he hoped their son would grow up strong and kind. Then he folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his shirt, close to his heart, as if the words themselves could form a shield. Thant, watching the Japanese consolidate their hold on his town, felt a different kind of disorientation. Some of the new arrivals spoke of Asia for Asians, of ending the old colonial order. Others simply took what they needed and moved on. He saw both the appeal of their message and the reality of their guns. That evening he sat with a group of friends in the back room of a shuttered shop and listened as one man argued that the Japanese might be liberators, another insisted they were only new masters, and a third said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on the floor. Thad thought of the British district officer he had sometimes seen walking through the market with his wife, the same man who had once praised his teaching. He wondered where that couple was now, whether they were already fleeing north or still trying to maintain the old routines in a world that had tilted overnight. The uncertainty pressed on everyone in the room like a physical weight. Yet when the conversation ended, they still shared what little food they had, still made plans to check on elderly neighbors in the morning. The small, stubborn habits of ordinary life continued even as the larger world burned. The first days of fighting taught hard lessons that no one could unlearn. The Japanese had mastered the art of appearing where they were least expected, of striking fast and then melting back into the green before a counterattack could form. The Allies, trained for different terrain and different enemies, found their heavy equipment bogged down, their communications cut, their confidence shaken by an opponent who seemed to fight by rules written in the jungle itself. Yet even in the middle of that shock, moments of unexpected grace kept appearing. A Japanese medic treated a wounded Indian soldier when his own unit had already moved on. An Allied pilot who had crash-landed walked for 2 days through hostile territory and was helped by a Burmese family who fed him and hid him from patrols, asking nothing in return. These were not the stories that would fill the official reports, but they were the ones that stayed with the men who lived them, small proofs that even in the middle of fire, the human instinct to reach across fear did not die completely. Sergeant Singh finally reached a larger British position late the next day, the wounded sepoy still alive on his back. He collapsed in the mud while medics took the boy, and for a long time he simply lay there, staring up at the canopy. The fear had not left him. It had settled somewhere deep in his bones, a new companion he would carry for the rest of the campaign. But alongside it had come something else, a quiet, fierce determination that surprised him. He had not run when running would have been easier. He had stayed with the boy. He had written a letter. In a war that seemed determined to strip men of everything that made them human, those small choices felt like victories no one else would ever see. Private Tanaka, resting briefly before the next push, thought about the farmer who had nodded to him and about the friend who would never return home. He wrote nothing in his own journal that night. Some things were too large and too raw for words. Instead, he cleaned his rifle with the same careful attention he had given it every evening since leaving Japan, as if the familiar ritual could hold the chaos at bay for a few more hours. Around him other soldiers did the same, the small, ordinary acts of maintenance that kept an army moving even when its men no longer recognized the world they were walking through. The jungle had awakened in fire, and the fire would not go out quickly. For the men and women caught inside it, whether they wore uniforms or simply tried to survive in its shadow, the only certainty was that nothing would ever return to the way it had been before the first shots cracked through the trees. The letters that would reach home in the coming weeks would carry new silences between the lines, new weights that families far away could feel even if they could not name them. And somewhere in that green vastness, Sergeant Rajit Singh, Private Kenji Tanaka, Thant, and thousands like them were already learning the hardest lesson of all, that courage in this war would not be measured by how loudly a man shouted, but by how quietly he kept moving forward when every instinct told him to stop. The reality of those opening clashes was far more intimate and unsparing than most accounts ever reveal, the sudden ambushes, the bodies left where they fell, the letters and photographs found on men who had believed they still had time. If you want to understand the raw, unfiltered faces and moments that defined those first hours in the jungle, our exclusive Gumroad digital archive holds rare, uncensored photographs, personal letters, and raw footage from the Burma Campaign that were simply too visceral for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Even as the Japanese advance continued its relentless push northward, the first cracks of doubt began to appear in the confidence of the victors. And the first stubborn seeds of resistance took root among those who had been pushed back. Sergeant Singh, resting at last with a cup of hot tea pressed into his hands by a stranger, looked at the exhausted faces around him and realized that the war was no longer something that happened to other people in other places. It had arrived here, in this green hell that did not care about maps or empires, and the only way any of them would survive it was by learning to fight not just with weapons, but with the quiet, unbreakable will to remain human when everything around them tried to strip that humanity away. The jungle had taken the first round without mercy. What came next would depend on whether the men inside it could find the strength to answer fire with something stronger than fear. When the first great oil tank exploded over Rangoon, the sky turned the color of old bruises and the air itself seemed to catch fire, and for Priya, a young Indian mother standing in the doorway of her small home with her 2 children clinging to her legs, the world she had built brick by brick simply stopped making sense. She had lived in Rangoon for 8 years, ever since her husband had found work in the docks unloading the ships that brought goods from across the empire. Their 2-room house had never been grand, but it had held the smell of her cooking and the sound of her children laughing, and that had been enough. Now the children were silent, their eyes wide as they watched the black smoke climb higher. Priya's husband had left 2 days earlier with a group of men trying to reach the north by train, promising to send word when he found a place for them. She had heard nothing since. Around her the streets were already filling with people dragging bundles, pushing carts, carrying children on their backs. Some shouted, some wept, most simply moved because standing still felt like waiting to die. Priya picked up her youngest, felt the small arms tighten around her neck, and stepped into the smoke. Not far away, in a modest bungalow that had once felt like a small piece of England, Margaret Harrington stood at her bedroom window watching the same black column rise above the city. Her husband had gone to the docks at first light, trying to secure passage on any boat or train still running. She had packed 2 small suitcases with the practical things, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, the letters from her sister that she could not bear to leave behind. Everything else, the books, the china, the curtains she had sewn herself, would have to stay. She kept telling herself that objects could be replaced, that lives could not, yet every time she looked at the piano in the corner she felt a small, private breaking. She had grown to love the slow rhythm of mornings here, the way the light moved across the floor, the neighbors who brought mangoes when they were in season. Now those same neighbors were gone or preparing to flee, and the city that had become her home was burning itself to the ground so the enemy could not use what remained. Out on the roads north of the city, Sergeant Rajit Singh walked beside a column of refugees that stretched farther than he could see. His unit had been ordered to help keep order during the evacuation, but order had already collapsed into something closer to survival. He carried his rifle, yet it felt useless against the things that were killing people now. Cholera had begun moving through the crowds like an invisible second army. He had seen a woman fall beside the road that morning, her body already stiffening before anyone could reach her. The child she had been carrying was still alive, screaming, until a stranger picked the little one up and kept walking without a word. Singh had tried to help where he could, sharing the last of his water, carrying an old man for a mile until his own legs threatened to give out. He thought constantly of his own wife and son back in Punjab, and the letter he had written weeks earlier that might still be sitting in some forgotten mailbag. He wondered if they would ever know what these roads had done to him. Thant had left his town 2 days after the Japanese arrived, not because he feared them directly but because staying felt like waiting for a future that no longer existed. He walked with a small group of neighbors who had decided together that the North offered the only chance. They carried rice, a few cooking pots, and the clothes on their backs. Thant kept thinking about the students he had left behind, the ones who had asked him what would happen when the old world ended. He had no answer for them then and even less now. Along the way they passed abandoned trucks, broken down buses, and the bodies of those who had simply stopped moving. At one point they came across a British family whose car had run out of fuel. The father was trying to push it while the mother held a baby and 2 older children walked beside her, their faces streaked with dust and tears. Thant's group stopped without speaking. They helped push the car to the side of the road, shared some of their rice, and walked on together for several miles before the paths diverged. No one asked names. The kindness required nothing in return except the knowledge that someone else had not been left completely alone. The destruction of Rangoon had been deliberate, part of a scorched earth policy meant to deny the advancing enemy the port, the fuel, the stores that could sustain an occupation. Yet the flames that consumed the oil tanks also consumed any remaining illusion that this war would spare ordinary lives. Priya reached the railway station with her children only to find the platforms already packed beyond capacity. Trains were leaving overloaded, people clinging to the sides, others running alongside until they could run no more. She managed to get her children onto one carriage by lifting them through a window while a stranger inside pulled them the rest of the way. She climbed in after them, the press of bodies so tight she could barely breathe. The train moved slowly, stopping often, sometimes for hours while rumors of Japanese patrols ahead spread through the carriages. In the stifling heat the children grew quiet, their small bodies limp against her. Priya kept one hand on each of them and tried not to think about the husband who might already be dead on some other stretch of track. Margaret and her husband finally secured space on a small steamer heading upriver, but the journey was nothing like the peaceful river trips they had once taken for pleasure. The boat was crowded with civilians and a few remaining soldiers, the deck stacked with whatever people had managed to carry. At night the sky behind them still glowed from the burning city, and Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She sat on a crate and listened to the low voices around her, the stories of homes left behind, of family members who had chosen to stay, of the fear that the Japanese would reach the north before anyone could find safety. Her husband sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers, and for the first time in their marriage she heard him speak of failure. He had believed the empire would hold. He had believed the plans would work. Now he spoke of the thousands of Indian and Burmese civilians who had been given no real plan at all, who were walking into a monsoon they could not outrun. Margaret squeezed his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would change what was already happening. On the roads, the columns grew longer and the suffering deeper. People who had started with carts and bundles now walked with nothing but the clothes they wore. Monsoon rains turned the tracks into rivers of mud. Disease spread faster in the crowded rest stops where the exhausted simply lay down and did not rise again. Sergeant Singh watched a young mother try to feed her baby with water from a roadside ditch and knew the child would not survive the night. He gave her the last of his own rations anyway, a small act that changed nothing for the larger tragedy but meant the mother did not have to watch her child die completely alone. Later that same day he found himself carrying a small Burmese boy whose parents had collapsed from exhaustion. The boy weighed almost nothing, yet Singh felt every step in his knees and back. He kept walking because stopping would have meant admitting that some lives were already beyond saving, and he could not bring himself to accept that yet. Thant's group reached a small village where the headman had decided to open the rice stores to anyone who passed through. It was a quiet, stubborn act of generosity in the middle of collapse. People sat in the mud and ate together, strangers from different towns and different languages sharing what little there was. Thant listened to an old Indian man describe the life he had built in Rangoon over 20 years, the shop he had opened, the grandchildren he had never met because they lived across the sea. The man spoke without bitterness, only a deep, tired sadness. When the meal ended, the headman's wife pressed extra rice into Thant's hands and told him to keep moving while he still had strength. He thanked her and walked on, carrying the weight of that kindness like a second pack. Priya's train finally stopped for good when the tracks ahead were reported blocked. She got her children off and began walking with the rest of the passengers, joining the vast river of people moving north. The children took turns riding on her back until her legs shook too badly to continue. Strangers helped. A man she had never seen before carried her youngest for an entire afternoon. A woman shared a handful of dried fish that kept them moving one more day. These small mercies did not stop the larger disaster, but they kept Priya from breaking completely. She began to understand that survival in this exodus was not a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of people refusing to let other people die alone. The retreat from Rangoon revealed a truth that military plans often forgot. When an army withdraws without preparing for the civilians who have lived alongside it, the result is not simply a lost city. It is thousands of families torn apart, thousands of children who will never forget the smell of burning oil mixed with rain and fear. The columns that moved north carried not only soldiers and officials but the entire human cost of a strategic decision made far away by people who would never walk these roads themselves. Margaret watched from the steamer as the banks slipped past and realized she was seeing the end of something larger than one campaign. She was seeing the end of the comfortable belief that empire could protect its own when the storm finally arrived. Sergeant Singh reached a temporary camp where medical teams were trying to treat the endless stream of sick and wounded. He handed the Burmese boy to a nurse who looked as exhausted as he felt, then sat on the ground and allowed himself, for the first time in days, to weep without shame. The tears came silently, mixing with the mud on his face. He thought of every person he had been unable to save, every child he had carried only to watch them slip away later. He thought of his own son growing up without knowing what these roads had cost. When the tears stopped, he stood up, drank the water someone pressed into his hand, and went back to helping where he could. There was no other choice left. Thant walked for 17 days before he reached the first real safety on the Indian side of the border. His group had shrunk and grown and shrunk again as people fell behind or joined from side paths. He had seen things he would never speak of to his sister, things that had changed the shape of his hope for independence. The Japanese might have ended British rule in Burma, but they had not brought the freedom he had imagined. They had brought a different kind of fear, and the roads north had shown him that freedom without safety was only another kind of loss. Yet he had also seen strangers become family, had seen people share their last food with those who had nothing, had seen the quiet refusal to let the worst of war strip away the best of what it meant to be human. Those things stayed with him as he crossed into India, tired, thinner, carrying only the clothes he wore and the memory of every kindness that had kept him alive. Priya finally reached a refugee camp in Assam with her children still breathing. She had no idea if her husband was alive. She had no home, no belongings, no certainty about what the next day would bring. Yet when she looked at her children sleeping on a straw mat inside a crowded tent, she felt something stubborn and wordless rise inside her chest. They had survived the burning city. They had survived the roads. They had survived the disease and the hunger and the endless walking. Whatever came next, she would find a way to keep them safe. That promise, made in silence while the rain hammered the tent roof, became the only future she allowed herself to hold. The great exodus from Rangoon was never recorded in the clean lines of military histories. It lived instead in the bodies left beside the tracks, and the children who grew up remembering only smoke and fear, and the quiet stories survivors told decades later about the stranger who had shared water or carried a child or simply refused to walk away. It taught anyone willing to listen that the true cost of war is never measured only in battles won or lost. It is measured in the ordinary lives that are shattered when empires decide that some places and some people can be sacrificed so that others might still have a chance. The columns kept moving long after Rangoon had fallen, carrying their grief and their small, unbreakable acts of care into whatever future waited on the other side of the border. And somewhere among them, Sergeant Ajit Singh, Thant, Priya, Margaret, and thousands more like them were already beginning to understand that the hardest part of survival was not reaching safety. It was learning how to live with everything they had seen and everything they had lost along the way. These journeys of ordinary people through fire and fear are the stories that history too often leaves behind, the ones that reveal what courage and suffering actually look like when the maps are put away. Bringing them to light with the honesty and care they deserve takes more time and heart than anyone ever sees from the outside. If these forgotten roads and the people who walk them have moved you even a little, perhaps you would consider supporting the creation of these stories with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1. So we can keep telling the human truths that matter most. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The rains continued to fall on the long columns heading north, and the war that had begun in the south was only just beginning to show its true face. For those who had already walked through Rangoon's burning and survived the roads that followed, the lesson was simple and brutal and strangely hopeful all at once. Even when everything burns, even when the world you knew disappears in smoke, the choice to keep caring for one another remains. That choice, repeated 1,000 times on those desperate tracks, was what allowed some to reach the other side still able to believe that tomorrow could be different. The exodus was over for those who made it. The story of what they would do with what remained was only beginning. General Joseph Stilwell stood at the edge of a muddy clearing in northern Burma, his face streaked with sweat and dust, and looked back at the column of people who had no choice but to follow him into the green unknown. Behind him were nurses who had never imagined they would march for their lives, missionaries who had spent years building hospitals and schools only to watch them fall, Chinese soldiers who had fought far from home, and a handful of American and British staff who still carried the stunned expression of men who had believed the line would hold. Stilwell's jaw was set in the same hard line his men had come to recognize, but those who knew him well could see the exhaustion underneath. He had been sent to help keep China in the war, to keep the supply lines open, to make the impossible possible. Now he was leading a ragged procession out of a country that had already been lost, and every step forward felt like an admission that everything he had been ordered to achieve had slipped away. Among the nurses was a young woman named Ruth, who had come to Burma with Dr. Gordon Seagrave's mobile hospital unit to care for the wounded in places most people back home could not even pronounce. She had spent the last weeks tending soldiers in makeshift wards while the front collapsed around them. Now she walked with a pack that felt heavier every hour, her shoes already falling apart, her hands blistered from gripping a walking stick someone had cut for her from the jungle. Ruth kept her eyes on the person in front of her because looking too far ahead made the distance seem impossible. She thought of the patients she had left behind, the ones too sick to move, and the quiet promise she had made to each of them that someone would come back. She knew it was a lie even as she said it, yet the lie had given them a moment of peace. That small mercy was all she had left to offer, and she carried the memory of it like a second pack. Stilwell moved up and down the column constantly, checking on stragglers, barking orders that somehow still carried respect rather than cruelty. He was not a gentleman. His temper was legendary, and more than one officer had felt the edge of it. But in these days of defeat he showed a different kind of care. He refused to let anyone fall behind if there was still breath in their body. When an older missionary stumbled and could not rise, Stilwell himself helped lift the man and walked beside him for a mile, talking in a low voice about anything except the war. The missionary later told Ruth that Stilwell had spoken of his own family back in America, of the garden he had left behind, of the ordinary life that now felt like something from another world. In that moment the general who was supposed to be made of iron revealed that he was simply a man trying to bring as many people home as possible from a place that no longer wanted them. Parallel to this desperate march, farther north and west, William Slim was fighting his own battle to hold something together. He had taken command of the shattered remnants of Burma Corps after the fall of Rangoon, and his task was no less impossible. Slim moved among his exhausted troops with the same relentless energy Stilwell showed, though his style was quieter, more measured. He listened to the reports of units that no longer existed, of supply dumps that had been destroyed or overrun, of men who had not eaten properly in days. Yet he also saw the small signs of resilience that kept an army from complete collapse. A sergeant who had lost his entire section still helped a wounded comrade to the next position. A young officer who had never expected to lead anything larger than a platoon organized a rearguard action that bought the main column another hour. Slim made a point of speaking to these men by name when he could, of acknowledging what they had done even when the larger picture was nothing but loss. He understood, in a way that many commanders never did, that the human spirit in defeat needed recognition more than it needed orders. Sergeant Ajit Singh was one of those men still moving under Slim's distant command. He had reached the northern areas after the long walk from the south, his uniform in rags, his body thin from days of short rations and constant movement. He had heard rumors of Stilwell's party somewhere to the east, a mixed group of Americans and nurses and civilians trying to reach India on foot through country the maps barely acknowledged. Singh did not know the details, but the story reached him in fragments from other retreating soldiers, and it stayed with him. The idea that even a general was walking out like any other refugee made the scale of the defeat feel both larger and strangely more human. Singh himself had carried wounded men, shared his last food with strangers, and kept moving when every part of him wanted to lie down in the mud and let the jungle take him. He wrote another letter to his wife in his head during the long nights, though there was no paper left and no certainty that any mail would ever leave Burma. In the letter he told her about the quiet courage he had seen in men who had nothing left to give except their refusal to abandon one another. The march Stilwell led was not a retreat in the clean military sense. It was a survival ordeal through some of the most difficult terrain in the world. The jungle pressed close on every side, the trails little more than animal paths that disappeared in the rain. Supplies were almost non-existent. The party lived on what they could carry and what the jungle occasionally offered. Disease moved through the column as surely as exhaustion. Ruth watched nurses who had once cared for others now struggling to care for themselves, their strength draining away with every mile. She shared what little medicine remained, rationed the quinine, and tried to keep spirits from breaking completely. One evening, when the rain had turned the trail into a river of mud, she sat beside an older nurse who could not stop shivering. Ruth wrapped her own thin blanket around the woman's shoulders and told her stories of the patients they had saved together, of the small victories that had once felt so important. The older nurse eventually slept, and Ruth stayed awake a little longer, listening to the sounds of the jungle and wondering whether any of them would ever see a hospital again. Stilwell kept the group moving with a mixture of iron will and unexpected tenderness. He knew that if the column fragmented, people would die alone in the green. He made decisions that sometimes seemed harsh, pushing the able-bodied to help the weak, refusing to leave equipment that could still be carried even when every extra pound felt like a curse. Yet those who marched with him later spoke of moments when he revealed the cost of those decisions. One night, sitting beside a small fire that barely pushed back the darkness, he spoke quietly to a few of his staff about the weight of knowing he had been sent to win and was now leading a retreat that felt like surrender. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply said the words out loud, as if naming the failure made it something they could all carry together. In that admission there was a strange kind of strength. It told the people around him that they were not alone in their sense of loss, and that even the man responsible for their safety was allowed to feel the full measure of what had been taken from them. The educational truth hidden inside this bitter march was simple and often forgotten in stories of victory. Defeat does not only break armies. It breaks the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they can endure. Stilwell's party had believed they were part of something larger and stronger than any single battle. The collapse of Burma stripped that belief away in weeks. What remained was the raw choice of whether to keep moving anyway. The nurses who continued walking even when their feet bled, the missionaries who shared their last strength with strangers, the Chinese soldiers who stayed with the column even though their own country's fate hung in the balance, all of them were learning the same lesson in different ways. Sometimes the only victory left is the decision not to let the worst of war turn you into someone you no longer recognize. Slim, watching his own shattered forces straggle into India, understood this lesson with particular clarity. He had seen units dissolve under pressure, had watched good men break under burdens no training could prepare them for. Yet he had also seen the opposite. He had seen soldiers who had lost everything except the will to help the man next to them. He had seen officers who refused to pass blame downward and instead took responsibility for what could still be saved. In the quiet conversations he held with exhausted commanders, Slim began to plant the seeds of what would later become the 14th Army's remarkable recovery. He spoke not of past glory but of future possibility. He asked men what they had learned in the jungle, what they would do differently when the time came to go back. The answers were often simple. Better supply. Better health discipline. Better leadership that treated soldiers as human beings rather than numbers on a map. These were not grand strategies yet. They were the hard-won wisdom of people who had walked through fire and lived to speak of it. Ruth and the other nurses reached India after weeks that blurred into one long, aching memory. Some of them could barely stand when they crossed the final ridge. Stillwell was there at the end, still moving among them, still making sure no one was left behind even in the moment of arrival. He looked older than when the march had begun, the lines on his face deeper, the fire in his eyes tempered by something closer to grief. Yet he also looked like a man who had kept a promise he had made to himself and to every person who had trusted him with their life. He gathered what remained of his party and spoke to them with a directness that left little room for self-pity. They had been beaten. They had lost a country. But they had brought almost everyone out alive, and that counted for something no map could measure. Then he turned and walked away to begin the long process of reporting what had happened and what would have to change. Sergeant Rajit Singh crossed into India a few days later with a group of survivors from his own unit. He was thinner than he had ever been, his uniform in tatters, his mind carrying images he knew he would never fully share with his wife. Yet when he finally sat down on solid ground that did not move beneath him, he felt something unexpected alongside the exhaustion. He felt the first stirrings of a new kind of resolve. The defeat had been total. The humiliation was real. But the small acts of care he had witnessed and performed on the long roads had shown him that even in the worst of circumstances, men could still choose to remain human. That choice, repeated across thousands of individual decisions, was what had allowed some of them to reach safety. Singh thought of Stillwell's column somewhere out there in the same green hell, and he hoped the general and his nurses had made it through. He hoped someone, somewhere, was writing down the stories of the people who had refused to let defeat strip them of everything that mattered. The bitter march out of Burma was never meant to be a story of triumph. It was a story of survival at the edge of what human beings can endure, of leaders who admitted failure and still refused to abandon those who depended on them, of ordinary people who discovered reserves of strength they had never known they possessed. It taught anyone willing to listen that the measure of a person or an army is not found only in the battles they win. It is found in the moments when everything has already been lost and the only choice left is whether to keep caring for one another anyway. Stillwell's party carried that lesson with them into India, along with their exhaustion and their grief. They carried it quietly, without fanfare, because the real work of learning from defeat happens not in the moment of loss but in the long, difficult days that follow when the survivors begin to ask what they will do differently the next time the jungle tries to swallow them whole. The stories of men like Stillwell and Slim, and of the nurses and soldiers who walked beside them, deserve to be remembered with the depth and honesty they earned through suffering. These are the chapters that reveal how great leaders are often forged not in victory but in the honest reckoning with everything that went wrong. If these accounts of resilience in the face of total defeat have stayed with you, I invite you to join our Patreon community, where you can access uncensored extended episodes, bonus podcasts with historians who have studied these moments deeply, raw video sections that show the human faces behind the history, and a chance to connect with fellow enthusiasts who believe the stories of the forgotten army deserve to be kept alive and explored together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the weeks that followed their arrival in India, the survivors of Stillwell's march began the slow process of healing bodies and minds that had been pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. Ruth and the other nurses eventually returned to their work, though the hospitals they built now carried the memory of everything they had left behind. Stilwell himself turned his fierce energy toward preparing for whatever came next, already arguing for the changes that would be needed if the Allies were ever to return to Burma on different terms. Slim, rebuilding his shattered forces in the shadow of the same defeat, began to shape the army that would one day march back in victory. Neither man spoke often of the long walk out. Yet both carried its lessons in the way they led from that point forward. They had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the true test of command is not what you achieve when everything goes right. It is what you do, and who you choose to remain, when everything has already gone wrong. The bitter march had ended. The long work of turning defeat into the foundation for something better was only beginning. William Slim walked through the crowded hospital wards in India where the survivors of Burma lay on narrow cots, and he stopped at each bed as though the man lying there was the only soldier who mattered in that moment. He spoke quietly, asking names, listening to the halting stories of what had been lost on the long roads north. Some of the men could barely lift their heads. Malaria had hollowed their faces and left their skin the color of old parchment. Others carried wounds that would never fully heal. Slim did not offer false promises or grand speeches. He simply stayed long enough for each man to feel seen, then moved to the next cot with the same steady attention. In those quiet conversations, something began to change in the broken army he had been given. The men who had staggered out of Burma carrying only their defeat started to sense that someone in authority finally cared more about their survival than about excuses or blame. Sergeant Rajit Singh lay in one of those wards, his body still fighting the fever that had nearly taken him on the final stretch of the retreat. He had written to his wife in his mind 100 times during the march, but the words had grown darker with every mile. Now, as Slim paused beside his cot and asked how he was feeling, Singh found himself answering with something closer to honesty than he had allowed himself in weeks. He spoke of the young sepoy he had carried, of the strangers who had shared water on the road, of the quiet shame of having left Burma behind. Slim listened without interrupting, then placed a hand briefly on Singh's shoulder and said that the army would need men who had already learned what it cost to survive. The words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of recognition. For the first time since crossing the border, Singh felt something other than exhaustion stir inside his chest. It felt dangerously close to hope. Slim had inherited an army that was more shadow than substance. The men who had fought in Burma were scattered across camps and hospitals, many of them still carrying the psychological weight of having been outmaneuvered, outfought, and finally driven from a country they had been told they must hold. Supplies were short. Morale was lower than any officer cared to admit. Higher command in Delhi and London seemed to have more urgent priorities elsewhere, and the soldiers who had survived the green hell sensed they had become the forgotten part of a larger war. Slim understood this neglect as clearly as he understood malaria. He made it his first task to change the story these men told themselves about who they were and what they could still become. He began with the things that could be controlled immediately. He ordered that every man receive proper medical care before any thought of new operations. Hospitals that had been overwhelmed were reinforced. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock to bring the sick back from the edge. Anti-malarial discipline became non-negotiable. Men who had once laughed at taking their daily tablets now saw officers standing in the same queues, swallowing the same bitter medicine. The message was simple and powerful: no one was too important to protect his own health, and no one was too small to be worth protecting. In the wards, nurses who had once felt invisible began to notice that their reports on patient conditions were actually being read and acted upon. Small improvements in diet, in rest periods, and the simple dignity of clean sheets and decent food started to return color to faces that had gone gray with defeat. Singh recovered slowly. The fever broke one morning while he was half dreaming of his son's face. When he could finally sit up without the world spinning, he was moved to a convalescent camp where the training had already begun to change. Instead of endless parades and pointless drills, the men were taken into the jungle patches that bordered the camps and taught how to move, how to listen, how to fight in the kind of terrain that had nearly destroyed them in Burma. Instructors who had survived the retreat shared hard-won lessons without shame. They demonstrated how to set ambushes on narrow trails, how to use the sound of rain to mask movement, how to carry just enough and no more. Singh found himself listening with an intensity he had never felt during his earlier training. These were not abstract tactics. They were the difference between dying alone in the green and coming home to write another letter to his wife. Slim visited these training areas often, arriving without ceremony and staying long enough to watch and to ask questions of the men themselves. He wanted to know what had failed them in Burma, what had frightened them most, what small things would have made the difference between holding and breaking. The answers were rarely about grand strategy. They spoke of boots that fell apart in the mud, of rations that left them too weak to fight, of officers who had never walked the trails themselves and therefore could not understand what was possible. Slim took these answers seriously. He made sure that new equipment reached the men who needed it most. He insisted that officers lead from the front during training marches, sharing the same discomfort and the same risks. Gradually, the men began to believe that their new commander was not simply giving orders from a distant headquarters. He was walking the same ground, learning the same lessons, and refusing to repeat the mistakes that had cost them so much. One young soldier named Ramesh, barely out of his teens, had arrived in India still carrying the image of his best friend falling beside him on the retreat. He had spoken little since crossing the border, eating only when ordered, sleeping with his eyes half open as though the jungle might still reach him in his dreams. In the new training program, he was paired with an older veteran who had survived the same roads. The veteran did not offer sympathy. He simply showed Ramesh how to move quietly through undergrowth, how to read the signs that an enemy had passed, how to trust the man beside him when visibility dropped to almost nothing. One afternoon during a long march in steady rain, Ramesh slipped and nearly fell into a swollen stream. The veteran caught him without a word, steadied him, and kept walking. That small, wordless act of care did what weeks of rest and medicine had not fully achieved. Ramesh began to speak again, first in short sentences during rest halts, later in the evenings when the men gathered around small fires. He spoke of his friend, of the home he had left, of the fear that had lived in his chest for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The other men listened without judgment. In that circle of shared stories, the army that had been broken began to knit itself back together, one honest conversation at a time. Slim's leadership extended beyond the training grounds and the hospitals. He made a point of visiting every unit he could reach, often arriving at unexpected hours and staying to eat the same food the men were given. He listened to complaints that other commanders might have dismissed as whining. He read the letters that came from families asking why their sons had been sent to a forgotten war with so little support. When he could not change the larger neglect from above, he changed what he could control on the ground. He made sure that mail from home reached the men as quickly as possible. He arranged for better rest periods between training exercises. He personally intervened when he found units still living in conditions that treated them as expendable. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. Men who had once avoided officers now sought them out with suggestions. Units that had fractured during the retreat began to function as teams again. The army that had felt invisible started to believe that someone at the top was fighting for them as fiercely as they had once fought for a lost cause. The innovation that would matter most in the campaigns ahead was already taking shape in these months of recovery. Slim and his staff began experimenting with air supply as a way to free troops from the tyranny of long, vulnerable ground lines. At first the experiments were small, a few planes dropping rations to units on training exercises. The men on the ground learned how to mark drop zones, how to recover supplies quickly, how to operate without the constant fear of running out of everything at once. What had once seemed like a distant logistical dream became a practical reality that changed the way soldiers thought about the jungle itself. The green no longer had to be an enemy that starved them. It could be a space they could move through with confidence because help could reach them from the sky. Singh participated in one of the early drops and felt a surge of something close to exhilaration when the parachutes blossomed overhead and the crates landed where they were needed. For the first time since Rangoon, he allowed himself to imagine returning to Burma not as a refugee but as a soldier who could be sustained no matter how deep the advance went. The emotional transformation was quieter but no less profound. Men who had written letters filled with defeat began to write with a different tone. They described the training, the care they were receiving, the sense that the army was finally being prepared for the war it was actually fighting rather than the war someone in a distant office had imagined. Families back home sensed the change even before the men themselves could fully name it. The letters carried less despair and more determination. Singh wrote to his wife about the new boots that did not fall apart in the mud, about the officer who had asked his name and remembered it days later, about the quiet pride that was returning to the faces around him. He did not promise victory. He simply told her that he was becoming a soldier again rather than a survivor, and that the difference mattered more than he had expected. Slim never claimed credit for these shifts in public. He gave the praise to the men themselves, to the doctors and nurses who had brought the sick back to health, to the instructors who had turned hard lessons into practical skills. Yet those who served under him knew that the change had begun with his decision to treat every soldier as a human being worth saving rather than a number to be spent. He had inherited an army that had been told, in 1,000 small ways, that it did not matter enough to be properly equipped or properly led. He gave it back its dignity one conversation, one hospital visit, one training exercise at a time. The forgotten army began to remember that it had never been forgotten by the man who now led it. The work of rebuilding was never dramatic in the way battles are dramatic. It happened in the daily choices to take malaria tablets even when no enemy was near, to train in rain that felt endless, to write letters that carried hope instead of grief. It happened when a veteran took a frightened young soldier under his wing and taught him how to stay alive. It happened when a nurse stayed an extra hour with a patient who had no one else. It happened when Slim himself stood in a chow line and ate the same food as the lowest private, making it clear that no one in this army was too important to share its hardships. These were the unglamorous foundations on which future victories would rest. They did not make headlines. They did not erase the memory of Rangoon burning or the long roads of defeat. But they created something that had not existed when the survivors first crossed into India. They created an army that believed it could still matter, that its lessons had value, and that its next fight, whenever it came, would be fought by men who had already learned the hardest truths about themselves and about the green country they would one day have to face again. The quiet, steady work of turning broken survivors into a force capable of returning to Burma deserves to be remembered with the same care we give to the battles themselves. These months of recovery contain hidden stories of resilience and leadership that shaped everything that followed, stories of forgotten heroes and hospitals and training camps whose daily choices made later victories possible. If these accounts of how an army was rebuilt from the inside out have moved you, I warmly invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, hidden heroes, and the overlooked chapters of history that rarely make it into the main narratives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. By the time the first real tests came again in the hills and jungles to the east, the men who had once staggered out of Burma carried themselves differently. They still remembered the cost of defeat. They still carried the private griefs of friends lost and homes left behind. But they also carried something new, a quiet confidence that had been rebuilt one conversation and one shared hardship at a time. William Slim had given them back their sense of purpose not by pretending the past had not happened, but by refusing to let that past define the future they could still shape together. The forgotten army was no longer forgotten by the man who led it, and that single fact changed everything that was still to come. The men who pushed into the Arakan hills carried the quiet confidence that months of rebuilding had given them, yet the jungle waited with a patience no training could fully prepare them for. And for the soldiers who found themselves suddenly cut off from everything behind them, the true measure of that confidence was about to be tested in ways none of them had imagined. Sergeant Rajit Singh moved with his section through the tangled hills and thick undergrowth, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation. The offensive had begun with hope. After the long months of recovery in India, after the training that had taught them how to move and fight in country like this, the men believed they were finally ready to push the Japanese back. Singh had written to his wife before leaving the base, telling her that this time the army felt different, that the officers seemed to understand what the jungle demanded. He had not written about the private fear that still lived in his chest, the memory of the retreat that woke him some nights in a cold sweat. Now, as his section advanced along a narrow track that wound between steep slopes, that fear returned in a new form. The enemy was not retreating. He was waiting. The Japanese response came not with a single great attack but with the same infiltration tactics that had shattered the earlier defenses. Small groups slipped through the gaps between forward positions, appearing behind the advancing troops, cutting tracks, ambushing supply parties, turning what had seemed like a steady advance into a series of isolated struggles. Singh's section was among those that found its route back suddenly blocked. They dug in on a low ridge and waited for orders that never came in clear form. For 2 days they held their small perimeter while Japanese patrols probed the slopes around them. The men spoke little during the daylight hours. At night they listened to the sounds of movement in the darkness and tried not to imagine how many enemies might be out there, waiting for the moment when fatigue or carelessness opened a gap. In a larger clearing a few miles away, a collection of units that had been pushed back from their forward positions formed what would later be called the admin box, a rough defensive position centered on a small supply dump and a cluster of makeshift medical posts. The men who found themselves inside that perimeter had not planned to make a stand there. They had been ordered forward and then found the way back cut. Now they faced the choice of holding or being overrun piecemeal. A young medical orderly named Anil worked in one of the aid posts, moving between wounded men with the steady hands that came from necessity rather than training. He had joined the army hoping to serve as a stretcher-bearer and had instead become someone who learned on the job how to keep men alive long enough for the next plane to bring more supplies or for the next attack to be beaten back. Anil wrote letters in his head to his family in a village he had not seen in 2 years, letters that described the work without the fear, because he knew that if he put the fear into words it might never leave him. The Japanese closed the ring around the admin box with the same patient, relentless pressure they had used throughout the campaign. They did not launch one great assault that could be met and broken. Instead, they kept the pressure constant, small attacks at different points around the perimeter, mortar fire that came without warning, snipers who seemed to know exactly where the gaps in the defense lay. Inside the box, the men learned quickly that every direction was now a possible front. There was no safe rear. Singh's section, when it finally linked up with the larger position, found itself assigned to a sector of the perimeter where the ground sloped away into thick cover that could hide an entire company until the last moment. He placed his men in shallow scrapes, shared out the ammunition that had been dropped by air the day before, and tried to keep their spirits from sinking as the hours stretched into days. The air supply that reached the box became the single thread that kept hope alive. Planes appeared overhead at irregular intervals, sometimes in daylight, sometimes at dusk, their engines a sound that lifted every head inside the perimeter. Parachutes blossomed and crates drifted down, some landing inside the defended area, others drifting into Japanese-held ground where they were lost. The men learned to mark drop zones with whatever they had, to recover the supplies quickly before the enemy could reach them, to ration what arrived because no one knew when the next drop would come. Anil stood in the open during one drop, waving his arms to guide a pilot who seemed to be circling too far out, and felt the rush of wind from the plane's wings as it passed low overhead. In that moment he understood something that no training lecture had ever made clear. The men on the ground were no longer fighting alone. An entire system of support was reaching down to them through the sky, and that knowledge changed the way they held their positions. The toll inside the box was brutal and constant. Disease moved through the crowded positions as surely as the enemy outside. Men who had been healthy when they entered the perimeter grew weak from dysentery and fever. Wounds that might have healed in a proper hospital festered in the heat and damp. Anil worked until his hands shook from exhaustion, then slept for an hour and returned to the aid post because there was no one else to take his place. He saw soldiers who had once seemed unbreakable break under the strain of constant alert and short sleep. He also saw quiet acts of care that kept others going. A sergeant from another unit brought extra water to the aid post without being asked. A young rifleman who had been wounded himself insisted on helping carry stretchers even though his own leg would barely support his weight. These moments did not change the larger situation, but they reminded every man inside the perimeter that they were still human beings responsible for one another. Singh experienced the same mixture of fear and stubborn endurance. During one night attack, his section held its ground against probes that came from two directions at once. He moved between his men, checking ammunition, offering water, speaking in the low, steady voice he had learned worked better than shouting. When a Japanese soldier broke through the thin wire and came at him with a bayonet, Singh fired at point-blank range and felt the recoil travel up his arm into his shoulder. The man fell almost at his feet. Singh did not look at the face. He simply stepped over the body and kept moving, because stopping to think about what he had done would have cost the lives of the men still depending on him. Later, when the attack had been beaten back and a brief silence fell over the perimeter, he sat with his back against the earth and wrote another mental letter to his wife. This one contained no promises of victory. It simply told her that he was still alive, that he was still trying to bring the men under his care home, and that the jungle had taught him that survival was not a matter of strength alone but of refusing to let the man next to you face the darkness by himself. The broader offensive faltered as the Japanese pressure grew and supply lines stretched beyond what the ground could support. Command decisions made far from the fighting failed to account for the speed with which the enemy could appear behind the forward troops. The men inside the admin box and in other isolated positions held because they had no choice, but the larger effort to clear the Arakan and open a route back into Burma ground to a halt. Yet the defense of those surrounded positions taught lessons that would matter more than any ground gained or lost. The soldiers learned that all-round defense was not a theory but a necessity. They learned that air supply could sustain a force that would otherwise starve. They learned that small unit leadership, the kind that happened between a sergeant and his section or between a medical orderly and the wounded around him, often decided who lived and who did not when larger plans collapsed. Anil stayed at his post until the perimeter was finally relieved by fresh troops who fought their way through from the outside. He helped load the last of the wounded onto waiting vehicles, then walked out of the position he had helped defend without once looking back. The exhaustion that settled over him was deeper than anything he had felt during the retreat from Burma. Yet beneath the tiredness there was a new understanding. He had seen what men could endure when they believed someone was still fighting for them from the sky and when they refused to abandon one another on the ground. That knowledge stayed with him as he moved to a rest area farther back, where he finally allowed himself to sleep without listening for the next attack. Singh's section was pulled out of the line after the immediate threat had passed. He sat with his men around a small fire and listened as they spoke of the nights they had spent listening to movement in the darkness, of the comrades who had not made it out, of the strange mix of pride and grief that came from having held when holding seemed impossible. One of the younger soldiers asked Singh what he thought would happen next. Singh did not answer with strategy or predictions. He simply said that they had learned how to fight this kind of war in the only place that could teach it, and that the next time they went forward they would carry those lessons with them. The men around the fire nodded without speaking. In the silence that followed, Singh felt the first stirrings of something he had not allowed himself to feel since the retreat. It was not yet confidence. It was something quieter, closer to acceptance that the army he served in was still learning, still changing, and that he was changing with it. The first Arakan offensive ended without the decisive victory that had been hoped for, yet the crucible of those surrounded positions forged something that could not be measured in ground held or lost. The men who walked out of the admin box and the other defensive stands carried with them the hard knowledge that jungle warfare rewarded the side that could sustain itself when cut off, that could maintain all-round defense when there was no safe rear, and that could keep caring for its wounded and its exhausted even when every instinct screamed to focus only on survival. These were not glamorous lessons. They did not erase the frustration of an offensive that had promised more than it delivered. But they became the foundation on which later successes would be built. The army that had once broken under the pressure of sudden infiltration was learning, position by position and man by man, how to turn that same pressure back on an enemy who had grown used to being the one who appeared from nowhere. The courage shown in those early, painful stands in the Arakan Hills deserves to be honored in ways that go beyond maps and after-action reports. If the quiet endurance of men like Sergeant Singh and the medical orderly Anil, who held their ground when everything around them tried to break them, has moved you, then perhaps you would like to hold a tangible reminder of that courage close. There are hand-picked World War II memorabilia and thoughtful books about the China-Burma-India theater available through Amazon, along with the powerful film Midway streaming on Prime Video, each one a way to honor the courage of all who fought across the Asian theater. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The lessons of the Arakan Crucible did not end when the last wounded man was carried out of the perimeter. They traveled with the survivors back to the training areas and the hospitals, where they were studied and absorbed and turned into new tactics and new habits. Singh returned to his unit with a deeper respect for the men who had stood beside him and a clearer understanding of what the jungle could still demand. Anil continued his work with the wounded, carrying the memory of the aid post under constant threat as a reminder of why every life saved mattered. The army as a whole carried forward the knowledge that air supply and all-round defense and small unit resilience could turn a potential disaster into a stand that bought time and saved lives. The first Arakan offensive had not delivered the breakthrough that had been hoped for, but it had delivered something more valuable in the long run. It had delivered proof that the men who had once been driven from Burma could now hold their ground when the enemy tried to do to them what they had once done to others. That proof, earned in mud and fear and quiet acts of care, became part of the story the forgotten army would carry into every future test the jungle still had waiting for them. The column moved like a living thing through the darkness, men and mules fused into one slow, breathing organism, and for the soldiers who had volunteered for this journey into the enemy's rear, the first night in Burma already felt like a test of whether their bodies and their minds could still belong to the same person. They had been chosen because they were willing to walk where maps ended and where the only certainty was that the jungle would try to break them before the Japanese ever did. Ord Wingate had gathered them with words that promised something different from the long retreat and the failed offensives that had come before. He spoke of striking deep, of forcing the enemy to look over his shoulder, of proving that a small force could make an entire army nervous about its own supply lines. The men who listened carried those words with them across the Chindwin River and into the hills beyond, though many would later wonder whether any speech could have prepared them for what the green darkness actually demanded. Private Thomas Ellis walked near the middle of one column, his pack cutting into his shoulders, his rifle balanced across the load. He had volunteered because the training had felt like the first honest preparation he had received since arriving in the theater. The long marches with full packs, the nights spent learning to move without sound, the lectures on living off what the jungle might offer had given him a sense that this time the army was not asking him to fight with yesterday's tactics in tomorrow's war. Yet even in those first hours after crossing the river, he felt the weight of isolation settle over the column like a second skin. There would be no quick rescue if things went wrong. There would be no artillery to call when the enemy appeared. The only safety lay in the men walking in front and behind, and in the mules that carried the heavier loads and sometimes seemed more sure-footed than the soldiers themselves. The mules became companions as much as burden-bearers. Thomas learned their names and their tempers, the way one would nuzzle his hand when it was hungry and another would plant its feet and refuse to move until coaxed with quiet words and a share of the precious grain. When a mule slipped on a muddy slope and broke its leg, the column stopped while the animal was put down with a single shot that echoed strangely among the trees. Thomas stood with the others and watched the body being dragged off the track, and he felt a sharp, unexpected grief for the creature that had carried their ammunition without complaint. In that moment he understood that this expedition would measure survival not only in miles covered or bridges destroyed but in the small, daily decisions about what could be saved and what had to be left behind. Wingate moved up and down the columns with the same restless energy he had shown in training. He was not a man who offered comfort easily. His voice could cut through exhaustion like a blade, and his standards left little room for weakness. Yet the men who marched with him also saw moments when that same intensity became a form of care. He would appear beside a soldier who was struggling with fever, demand to know what medicine had been taken, and then ensure that the next airdrop included extra quinine or whatever else the column needed. He spoke to the men not as numbers but as individuals whose endurance was the only thing standing between the operation and failure. Some loved him for that fierce attention. Others feared the way his eyes seemed to see every lapse before it happened. All of them understood that the success or failure of this strange new kind of war would rest as much on his vision as on their ability to keep putting one foot in front of the other. The jungle itself became the first real enemy. Leeches dropped from leaves and found their way inside clothing, leaving trails of blood that itched and burned. Thomas learned to check his body each time the column halted, running his hands over skin that was already raw from sweat and friction. Malaria struck without warning, turning strong men into shivering shadows who had to be carried or left behind. The column moved at the pace of its slowest members, and every delay increased the chance that the Japanese would discover their presence. Yet the same jungle that punished them also offered moments of unexpected grace. Clear streams where they could wash away the worst of the filth. Patches of fruit that tasted sweeter than any meal back in the base camps. Nights when the rain stopped and the stars appeared between the branches, reminding them that there was still a world beyond the green walls that pressed in on every side. Small acts of kindness became the currency that kept spirits from collapsing completely. When one man's boots finally disintegrated, another cut strips from his own spare shirt to wrap the ruined feet. When fever left a soldier too weak to eat, his section mate sat with him and coaxed spoonfuls of rice into his mouth, speaking in a low voice about home and the letters they would write when this was over. Thomas found himself sharing the last of his tobacco with a Gurkha rifleman who had walked beside him for days without complaint. The Gurkha accepted the gift with a quiet nod and later repaid it by showing Thomas how to move through thick undergrowth without leaving obvious signs for anyone who might follow. These exchanges did not change the larger odds against them, but they reminded every man that he was not walking alone. The first real operation came when the column reached a stretch of railway that carried Japanese supplies toward the front. Thomas was part of the group sent forward to place charges on a vulnerable section of track. They moved at night, guided by the sound of the rails and the occasional glow of a distant signal lamp. The work was done in near silence, hands working by feel, every man listening for the sound of approaching patrols. When the charges were set and the column had withdrawn to a safe distance, the explosion rolled through the hills like distant thunder. For a brief moment Thomas felt a fierce satisfaction. They had struck back. They had made the enemy pay attention to his own rear. Yet the satisfaction faded quickly when the Japanese response began. Patrols swept the area with more determination than before. The column was forced to move faster, to leave more behind, to accept that every success would bring a heavier price. Wingate's vision had always carried this tension inside it. He believed that long-range penetration could force the Japanese to divert troops from the main front, that the psychological effect of raiders appearing deep behind their lines would be worth the cost in men and mules. The soldiers who lived the reality of that vision saw both its power and its limits. They disrupted supply movements. They forced the enemy to spread his forces thinner. They proved that determined men could survive for weeks in country the maps treated as impassable. But they also paid in bodies left beside trails that no one would ever mark, and men who simply sat down one day and could not be persuaded to rise again, and the slow erosion of strength that came from carrying everything they needed on their own backs or on the backs of animals that were themselves growing weaker with every mile. Thomas felt that erosion most clearly in the later weeks, when the column had been moving almost continuously and the rations had been cut to the bone. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette from the dwindling supply. His thoughts drifted to his family in ways that made it harder to focus on the next step. One evening, after a long day of avoiding Japanese patrols, he sat with his back against a tree and tried to write a letter in his mind to his sister. He wanted to tell her that he was still alive, that he was still trying to do something that mattered, but the words kept slipping away into the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. A comrade sat down beside him without speaking and passed over a small piece of chocolate that had been saved from an earlier airdrop. The gift was offered without ceremony, yet it carried more meaning than any speech. It said that even here, even now, they were still looking out for one another. The decision to turn back came when it became clear that the column could no longer sustain effective operations without risking complete destruction. Wingate gave the order with the same directness he had shown throughout, and the men who heard it felt a complicated mixture of relief and something close to grief. They had come so far, struck so many small blows, and yet the larger war they had hoped to influence still seemed distant and unchanged. The journey out was in some ways harder than the journey in. They were weaker, more closely pursued, and carrying the knowledge that not everyone who had crossed the Chindwin with them would cross back. Thomas walked with his section through country that had become familiar in the worst possible way, every landmark now a reminder of how much had been lost on the way forward. When the survivors finally reached safety on the Indian side of the border, the reception was muted. The operation had achieved some of its goals. It had disrupted Japanese movements. It had given the men back in the main army a story of daring that lifted spirits. But it had also cost more than many commanders had expected, and the questions about whether such long-range efforts were worth the price would linger long after the last exhausted man had been fed and rested. Thomas sat in a quiet corner of a base hospital and finally wrote the letter to his sister that he had been composing in his head for weeks. He did not describe the leeches or the fever or the nights when he had lain awake listening for footsteps that never came. He wrote instead about the men who had walked beside him, about the mule that had carried their supplies until its strength gave out, about the small acts of care that had kept him moving when every part of him wanted to stop. Those were the things, he realized, that he wanted her to remember if his own story ended somewhere in the green hills he had just left behind. The first Chindit expedition opened a door into a new way of thinking about jungle warfare, one in which small, highly trained groups could operate far beyond the reach of conventional forces and force an enemy to defend everywhere at once. Yet it also revealed the human limits of that vision. The men who returned carried bodies that would never fully recover and memories that would never fully fade. They had proven that endurance and brotherhood could accomplish remarkable things in impossible country. They had also learned that courage alone could not replace the need for better supply, better medical support, and a clearer understanding of what such operations could realistically achieve. Those lessons would shape the much larger Chindit effort that came later, and they would influence how special operations were planned across the theater. But for the soldiers who had lived the first Odyssey, the real story was never about strategy or doctrine. It was about the quiet decision, made again and again on muddy trails and in fevered nights, to keep caring for the man next to you even when the jungle and the enemy and your own exhausted body all seemed determined to make that care impossible. The raw, unfiltered reality of those long marches through leech-infested trails, the exhaustion that hollowed men's faces, the small acts of stubborn humanity that kept some alive while others were left behind, lives in photographs and letters and fragments of footage that were never meant for ordinary viewing. If you want to see the unvarnished faces and moments that defined the first Chindit columns, our exclusive Gumroad digital archive holds rare, uncensored photographs, personal letters, and raw footage from the Burma Campaign jungles that were simply too visceral and restricted for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who had walked with Wingate returned to an army that was still learning how to fight this kind of war, and their experiences became part of the quiet, steady work of turning hard lessons into future capability. Thomas Ellis recovered his strength in the months that followed and found himself thinking often of the column that had become, for a time, the only world that mattered. He carried the memory of the Gurkha who had taught him how to move without sound, of the mule whose death had felt like the loss of a friend, of the comrade who had shared the last piece of chocolate without expecting anything in return. Those memories did not erase the cost of the expedition. They simply reminded him that even in the middle of operations that pushed human beings past every reasonable limit, the choice to remain human had still been possible. That choice, repeated across hundreds of individual decisions on trails that maps could not name, was what allowed some of them to come back with stories worth telling and with the quiet knowledge that the next time the army asked them to walk into the unknown, they would carry not only their weapons but the hard-won understanding of what it truly cost to keep moving when everything around them tried to make stopping feel like mercy. Rinya Mutaguchi stood in the dim light of a captured headquarters, his finger tracing the thin red lines that stretched across the map toward India, and he felt the old certainty rise in his chest like a tide that had carried him from one victory to the next. He had led men through Malaya and into Singapore, and the memory of those successes still lived in his voice when he spoke to his officers. The British would break again, he told them. Their Indian soldiers would not fight for an empire that had already failed them. The spirit of Japan would prove stronger than any number of guns or any length of supply line. Around the table his commanders listened, some nodding, others keeping their doubts behind careful faces. They had all seen what overconfidence could cost when the jungle turned against an army that believed it could not lose. Yet Mutaguchi's conviction was infectious. He spoke of the coming offensive as if the outcome had already been decided by something larger than logistics or weather or the exhaustion that had settled into every veteran's bones. Among the Japanese soldiers preparing for the advance, Private Kenji Tanaka felt that same mixture of pride and quiet unease that had followed him since the first days in Burma. He had marched long distances before. He had lived on short rations and fought when his body told him to rest. But this time the distances on the map looked longer, and the talk of capturing Impol and cutting the supply route over the mountains carried a weight that previous operations had not. Tanaka wrote a short letter to his family before the column moved out, telling them only that he was well and that the army was moving forward again. He did not write about the rumors that the British had learned from their earlier defeats, or about the new kind of army that seemed to be waiting on the other side of the hills. Some things were better left unsaid when the only choice was to keep walking. On the other side of the coming battle line, Sergeant Rajit Singh sat in a forward position near Impol and read a letter from his wife that had finally reached him after weeks of delay. She wrote about their son learning to walk, about the small garden she was trying to keep alive despite the heat, about the quiet hope that the war might end before their boy grew old enough to understand what his father had seen. Singh folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. He had felt the change in the air for days now. More patrols were coming back with reports of Japanese movement on the far side of the Chindwin. Supplies were being stockpiled. Officers who had once spoken of rest and training now spoke of holding ground at all costs. Singh did not know the details of the coming offensive, but he knew the look of men who were bracing for something larger than the skirmishes they had grown used to. He checked his section's ammunition and water one more time, then sat with his back against the earth and let himself think, for a few quiet minutes, of the life waiting on the other side of this war. The Indian National Army soldiers who would march with the Japanese carried a different kind of weight. Many of them had been captured in earlier battles and had chosen, or been persuaded, to join the force that Subhas Chandra Bose had built with Japanese support. For some the decision had come from genuine belief that British rule must end and that any ally against it was worth accepting. For others, it had been a choice made in the exhaustion and despair of a prisoner of war camp, when the alternative seemed to be slow death from disease and neglect. One young man named Anil, who had once worn a British Indian Army uniform, now marched in the ranks of the INA and tried not to look too closely at the faces of the soldiers on the other side who looked so much like his own brothers. He had heard Bose's speeches on the radio, the passionate calls for independence that stirred something deep in men who had grown up under foreign rule. Yet in the quiet hours before the advance began, Anil found himself wondering what victory would actually look like if it came at the cost of fighting and killing men who shared his language and his memories of home. Mutaguchi's plan was bold to the point of recklessness. His army would cross the Chindwin, drive hard for Impol and Kohima, and cut the vital supply route that kept the Allies in the theater supplied from the air. If successful, the capture of Impol would open the way into the Brahmaputra Valley and perhaps spark the revolt in India that Bose promised would follow any major Japanese success. The officers who studied the maps saw the distances and the monsoon that would soon turn every track into mud. They saw the supply columns that would have to keep up with fast-moving infantry. They saw the risk that the British, now better supplied and better led, might not break as easily as they had in 1942. But Mutaguchi's confidence carried the day. He had been right before when others had doubted. He believed he would be right again. The soldiers who began the long march carried that belief with them in different ways. Some marched with the quiet fatalism of men who had already survived too many campaigns to expect an easy victory. Others carried the old fire of early war, the sense that spirit and discipline could overcome any material shortage. Tanaka walked with his section and tried to keep his mind on the next ridge rather than the larger gamble. When the column halted for a brief rest, he shared a cigarette with a comrade who had fought beside him since Singapore. They spoke of small things, the taste of food they missed, the villages they had left behind, the hope that this push would finally bring the war to an end. Neither man mentioned the possibility that the gamble might fail, or that the British positions ahead might be stronger than the ones they had overrun in earlier years. On the Allied side, the sense of an approaching storm grew stronger with every patrol report. Singh's section was ordered to strengthen its positions and to prepare for attacks that might come from unexpected directions. The men worked in the heat, digging deeper, stringing wire, stacking ammunition where it could be reached quickly. In the evenings they wrote letters or played quiet games of cards, the ordinary rituals that kept fear from taking over completely. Singh found himself thinking more often of the young sepoy he had carried during the retreat, the boy whose face still appeared in his dreams. He wondered whether the lessons learned on those long roads would be enough when the Japanese came again in strength. He did not speak those doubts aloud. Instead, he made sure every man in his section knew his position and his duty, and he walked the perimeter one last time before darkness fell, speaking each soldier's name as he passed. The Indian soldiers in the INA felt the tension in a different register. Anil marched with men who spoke of freedom and of the end of empire, yet he could not forget the faces of the Indian troops who still wore British uniforms and who would soon be firing at him across the same hills. Some of his comrades had already begun to question whether the Japanese would truly hand India to its people once the British were gone. Others clung to the belief that any blow against the old order was worth striking. Anil kept his own counsel. He wrote no letters home because he did not know what words could explain the path he had chosen. Instead, he focused on the men around him, on the small daily tasks of keeping weapons clean and water bottles full, on the fragile bonds that formed between soldiers who had little in common except the decision to march into a battle that might decide the future of their country. Mutaguchi's gamble was not only military. It was also a bet on the power of belief over material reality. He counted on his men's willingness to endure hardship that would break lesser armies. He counted on the British Indian forces fracturing under pressure. He counted on the monsoon arriving late enough for his columns to reach their objectives before the rains turned every advantage into mud. The soldiers who carried that bet forward did so with a mixture of courage and fatalism that had become familiar to them over years of war. They did not know that the British they faced had spent the months since the retreat building an army that understood jungle warfare in ways the earlier defenders never had. They did not know that air supply would allow surrounded positions to hold far longer than anyone had expected. They knew only that their commander believed victory was possible and that their duty was to make that belief real with every step they took. As the columns crossed the Chindwin and began the long climb toward the hills that guarded Impol and Kohima, the human cost of the gamble began to reveal itself in small, ordinary ways. Men who had marched for days on short rations felt their strength fading. Mules and porters struggled with loads that grew heavier with every mile. Officers who had once spoken confidently of rapid advance now spoke of conserving ammunition and of the need to reach supply dumps that might or might not still be in friendly hands. Tanaka felt the first sharp edge of doubt when he saw how far the column still had to go and how little food remained in the packs. He did not speak of it. He simply tightened the straps on his pack and kept walking, because stopping would have meant admitting that the spirit his commander trusted might not be enough to overcome the distance and the coming rain. On the other side of the hills, Singh and his men waited in positions that had been strengthened with every lesson learned from earlier defeats. They had better weapons, better medical support, and the knowledge that help could reach them from the air if the worst happened. Yet they also carried the memory of what it had felt like to be cut off and driven back. That memory made them dig deeper and check their fields of fire one more time. Singh wrote another letter to his wife in the quiet before the first Japanese patrols were reported. He told her that he was well, that the men around him were steady, and that he was thinking of their son learning to walk. He did not write about the tension that had settled over the camp or about the certainty that the next days would test everything they had rebuilt since the long retreat. Some truths were too large for letters that might never reach home. The gamble had been made. The columns were moving. On both sides of the coming battle line, men who had never met and who would never know each other's names were walking toward the same hills carrying hopes and fears that had little to do with the maps their commanders studied. Some believed they were striking a blow for freedom. Others believed they were defending the last line before India itself. All of them carried the private knowledge that courage and endurance would be measured not in grand speeches but in the daily choice to keep moving when every part of the body and the spirit wanted to stop. The hills ahead did not care which side held the stronger belief. They would test every man who entered them with the same indifference, and the outcome would depend on which army had learned more from the defeats that had come before. The human stories behind this daring and ultimately tragic offensive deserve to be told with the care and honesty they earned through suffering and courage on both sides. These are complex chapters of divided loyalties, overreaching ambition, and ordinary soldiers caught in a gamble that would cost thousands of lives. If these accounts of men like Mutaguchi's soldiers and the Indian troops on both sides of the line have moved you even a little, perhaps you would consider supporting the creation of these stories with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1, so we can keep bringing these forgotten human truths to light with the research and heart they require. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The first clashes began as the Japanese columns reached the outer defenses, and the gamble that had seemed so certain in headquarters maps began to meet the reality of ground that favored the defender and an enemy that had learned not to break. For the men on both sides who had marched or waited in the hills, the real test was only beginning. The spirit that Mutaguchi trusted would soon face the hard arithmetic of supply and reinforcement that no amount of belief could change. And in the days that followed, the soldiers who had carried that gamble forward would discover whether courage alone could overcome the distance, the weather, and the quiet strength of an army that had finally learned how to fight the war it had been given. On a rain-slicked ridge in the Naga Hills, a handful of exhausted men looked down from the veranda of the deputy commissioner's bungalow and realized that the neat rectangle of grass below them, once used for afternoon games of tennis, had become the ground on which the fate of India itself might be decided. The Japanese had come in strength, their columns moving with the same relentless patience that had carried them across so much of Asia. They had surrounded the small garrison almost before the defenders understood how close the danger had drawn. Inside the perimeter, roughly 2,000 men from British, Indian, and Gurkha units held a shrinking patch of high ground that included the bungalow, a few outbuildings, and the tennis court whose white lines were already blurred by mud and blood. They had little water, limited ammunition, and no certainty that help would reach them before the enemy finally broke through. Yet they stayed, because there was nowhere left to go and because the ridge behind them guarded the road to Dimapur and the wider plains of India. Sergeant Rajit Singh moved between his men along one sector of the perimeter, checking positions that had been dug and redug under constant fire. He had arrived with a small reinforcement party only days earlier and had quickly understood that this was no ordinary defensive stand. The Japanese attacked at any hour, from any direction, using the folds of the ground and the thick vegetation to get close before revealing themselves. Singh had seen men die in the retreat from Burma, but this was different. Here the enemy was not simply pushing forward. He was trying to erase the last organized resistance that stood between him and the heart of India. Singh wrote a short letter to his wife during a brief lull, telling her that the men around him were steady and that he was proud to serve with them. He did not write about the fear that lived in his chest or about the certainty that many of them would not leave this ridge alive. Some truths were too large for paper that might never reach home. Among the Gurkha riflemen holding a forward sanger near the tennis court was a young soldier named Burma, whose quiet competence had already earned him the respect of the men around him. He had grown up in the hills of Nepal and knew how to move across broken ground without sound. In the close fighting that developed around the bungalow, that skill became something more than training. Burma would slip forward in the darkness, listen for the soft sounds of Japanese soldiers preparing another probe, and return with information that allowed the defenders to shift their few reserves before the attack came. He never spoke of fear. Instead, he spoke of the duty to hold the ground so that the families behind them would not have to face what he had already seen in other places. When a comrade was wounded during one night attack, Burma carried him back across open ground under fire, moving with the same steady pace he used on patrol. The wounded man lived long enough to reach the aid post, and Burma returned to his sanger without comment, as if the act had been no more than the next task in a long list of necessary things. The fighting on and around the tennis court became the heart of the defense. Japanese soldiers reached the wire and sometimes breached it, forcing the defenders into hand-to-hand combat where bayonets and rifle butts replaced aimed shots. The ground itself became treacherous, churned by shells and rain into a slick paste that made every step uncertain. Young soldiers who had never imagined killing another man at arm's length found themselves doing exactly that, then returning to their positions shaking and silent. One British lieutenant, barely out of his teens, wrote a final letter to his parents during a moment when the firing had slackened. He told them he was proud of the men he led and that he hoped they would understand why he could not come home. He folded the letter, placed it inside his tunic, and went back to checking the positions along the court's edge. Hours later he was killed leading a counterattack that restored a section of the line. The letter was found when his body was recovered after the relief, and it was sent home with the rest of his belongings, a small rectangle of paper that carried more weight than any official citation. Water became more precious than ammunition. The garrison's supply had been cut early, and every drop had to be rationed with painful care. Men learned to sip from their bottles only when ordered, and even then the taste of metal and dust was constant. During one particularly fierce exchange of fire, a Gurkha rifleman noticed that a wounded Indian soldier nearby was trying to reach his water bottle with a hand that no longer worked. Without hesitation, the Gurkha crawled across the open ground, took the bottle, and held it to the wounded man's lips. Both were hit by a burst of machine gun fire before they could move back, yet the simple act of sharing what little water remained stayed with every man who witnessed it. In the middle of a battle that offered almost no mercy, that small kindness became a reminder that they were still human beings responsible for one another. The Japanese pressure never let up. Mortar bombs fell among the positions at irregular intervals. Snipers picked off anyone who showed himself for more than a few seconds. At night the defenders could hear the enemy digging closer, the soft scrape of tools in the earth that meant another trench or another tunnel was being prepared. Burma and the men around him learned to listen for those sounds and to answer them with grenades or quick counterattacks that kept the Japanese from gaining a permanent foothold. The cost was high. Every successful defense left fewer men to hold the next attack. Yet the garrison did not break. They had nowhere to retreat and no illusion that surrender would bring mercy. They held because the alternative was unthinkable and because the men beside them were still standing. Sergeant Singh found himself in the thick of one such night attack, moving along his section's positions with ammunition and encouragement. A Japanese soldier broke through the wire almost at his feet, and Singh fired at point-blank range before the man could throw the grenade he carried. The explosion still happened, but it happened far enough away that only Singh's arm was cut by fragments. He kept moving, binding the wound with a strip torn from his own shirt, because stopping would have meant leaving the men on either side without leadership. Later, when the attack had been beaten back and a brief, exhausted silence fell over the ridge, he sat with his back against the earth and thought of his son learning to walk. The image was so clear that for a moment he could almost hear the child's laughter. Then the firing started again, and Singh rose and returned to his section, because the only way to protect that distant laughter was to keep the ridge from falling. The relief force that finally fought its way up from the plains did not arrive as a single dramatic wave. It came in pieces, units that had themselves suffered heavy losses to reach the garrison. When the first elements of the relieving division made contact, the men inside the perimeter did not cheer. They were too tired, too thinned by casualties, too wary of another Japanese counterattack that might still come. Yet something shifted in the way they held their weapons and in the way they looked at one another. They had not been abandoned. The larger army had remembered them and had paid its own price to reach them. Burma was among those who walked out of his sengir for the first time in days and stood on ground that was no longer under constant fire. He looked at the tennis court, now a churned expanse of mud and shell craters, and felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with victory parades. They had held. Against overwhelming numbers, against hunger and thirst and constant attack, they had held long enough for help to arrive. The stand at Kohima became legendary because it showed what a small, determined force could achieve when every man understood that retreat was not an option and that the ground beneath his feet mattered more than his own survival. The terrain helped. The ridge offered natural defensive lines that the Japanese could not easily outflank without exposing themselves to fire from above. The leadership at every level, from section commanders like Singh to the officers who coordinated the shrinking perimeter, refused to accept that the position was lost. Most of all, the men themselves refused to break. They shared water when there was almost none left. They carried wounded comrades under fire. They wrote final letters and then returned to the line because the man next to them was still fighting. These were not the actions of heroes in the storybook sense. They were the actions of ordinary soldiers who had decided that the alternative to holding was something they could not live with. The broader campaign turned on moments like these. The defense of Kohima bought time for the larger forces at Impol to reorganize and for reinforcements to arrive. It denied the Japanese the quick victory they needed if their gamble was to succeed. It proved to every soldier on both sides that the British Indian Army that had retreated in 1942 was no longer the same force. Yet for the men who lived through the siege, the meaning was simpler and more personal. They had faced the worst the enemy could throw at them and had not broken. They had discovered reserves of endurance and loyalty that no training could have created. And they had done it together, in a place where the only certainty was that every man's survival depended on the man beside him. The epic stand at Kohima, where a few thousand held against far greater numbers on a ridge that became a symbol of unbreakable will, deserves to be remembered with the depth and honesty it earned through suffering and courage. These are the stories of ordinary men who became extraordinary not through grand gestures but through the daily refusal to let the man next to them face the darkness alone. If these accounts of the tennis court and the ridge have stayed with you, I warmly invite you to join our Patreon community, where you can access uncensored extended episodes that explore these moments in greater detail, bonus podcasts with historians who have studied the human cost of Kohima, raw video sections that show the terrain and the remnants of the battlefield, and a chance to connect with fellow history enthusiasts who believe the stories of the forgotten army deserve to be kept alive and shared. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the last Japanese attacks were finally beaten back and the ridge was secure, the survivors walked among the shell craters and the wire with a quiet that had nothing to do with triumph. They had lost too many friends. They had seen too much. Yet they had also proven something that would matter in every battle still to come. A small force, well led and determined to hold, could stop an army that believed its spirit alone could conquer any distance or any defense. The tennis court at Kohima would never again be used for games. It had become something else entirely, a patch of ground where ordinary men had decided that some lines simply could not be crossed. And because they held that line, the larger tide of the campaign began, slowly and at terrible cost, to turn. The Japanese closed the ring around Impol with the same patient certainty that had carried them across so much of Asia, yet inside the perimeter the men and women who found themselves surrounded discovered that help could still reach them from the sky in ways no one had imagined possible. Sergeant Rajit Singh stood on a low rise overlooking the Impol plain and watched the first transport planes appear through the clouds like distant birds that had learned to ignore the weather. The Japanese had cut every road into the valley weeks earlier, and the men around him had felt the first sharp edge of isolation settle over the positions. Ammunition was already being rationed. Food was being measured in smaller portions. The monsoon had begun to turn every track into mud, and the sound of distant shelling reminded everyone that the ring was tightening. Yet when the planes droned overhead and parachutes bloomed against the gray sky, something shifted in the way the soldiers looked at one another. They were not alone. An entire system of supply and reinforcement was reaching down to them through weather that should have grounded every aircraft. Singh turned to the young sepoy beside him and said quietly that the army had remembered them. The sepoy nodded without speaking, his eyes still fixed on the drifting crates, and in that moment the fear that had lived in his face since the roads were cut began to ease. Inside the perimeter the daily rhythm of siege took hold quickly. Japanese artillery and mortar fire fell at irregular intervals, sometimes concentrated on the forward positions, sometimes reaching deeper into the valley where civilians still tried to carry on some semblance of ordinary life. Singh's section held a stretch of high ground that overlooked one of the main approach routes. They dug deeper every day, reinforcing Sangars with whatever timber and earth they could find, and they learned to move only when necessary because every unnecessary movement drew fire. At night they listened for the soft sounds of Japanese patrols probing the wire. During the day they watched the sky for the planes that had become their lifeline. The airdrops did not arrive every day, and when the weather closed in completely the men felt the old anxiety return. Yet even on the days when nothing fell from the sky, they knew the system was still working somewhere beyond the clouds. Reinforcements were being flown in to replace casualties. Wounded men were being flown out to hospitals that could actually save them. The contrast with the long retreat of 1942 was so sharp that some soldiers spoke of it in low voices, as if naming the difference might somehow protect them from slipping back into that earlier despair. The Japanese soldiers outside the ring experienced a different kind of siege. Their supply columns had been stretched to the breaking point before the offensive even reached Impol, and once the monsoon began in earnest those columns could no longer move with any reliability. Private Kenji Tanaka, who had marched with such certainty at the beginning of the gamble, now found himself in a forward position where rice was measured in handfuls and where the constant rain turned every uniform into a sodden weight that never dried. He had seen men grow weak from hunger and from the diseases that flourished in the wet and the mud. He had watched comrades die not from bullets but from simple exhaustion and the failure of bodies that could no longer fight the conditions around them. Tanaka still believed in the spirit his commanders had invoked, yet he also saw the reality that spirit alone could not fill empty stomachs or stop the slow collapse of units that had run out of everything except courage. When he wrote home, which was rarely now, he spoke only of the weather and of the hope that the offensive would succeed soon. He did not write about the growing certainty that the British positions inside the ring were being sustained in ways his own army could not match. Air supply transformed the nature of the defense in ways that went beyond simple logistics. Fresh units were flown into the valley and inserted directly into the line, allowing tired formations to be pulled back for rest and reorganization. Medical teams received supplies that would have been impossible to bring overland. Even small comforts, extra rations or clean clothing or the simple knowledge that someone outside the ring was still thinking of them, reached the men who needed them most. Singh participated in one recovery operation after a drop that had gone slightly off target. He and his section moved out under covering fire to bring in crates that had landed near Japanese positions. They worked quickly, dragging the heavy loads back across open ground while mortar bombs fell around them. When they finally reached safety with the supplies, the men around them greeted them with a quiet gratitude that had nothing to do with ceremony. The crates contained food and ammunition, but they also contained proof that the larger army had not written them off. That proof mattered as much as the contents themselves. Civilians inside the Imphal perimeter lived through the same months with their own mixture of fear and endurance. Families who had lived in the valley for generations found themselves sharing space with soldiers and with refugees who had fled from the advancing Japanese columns. Food was scarce for everyone, and the constant sound of artillery made sleep difficult even for children. Yet the airdrops reached them too. Medical supplies arrived for clinics that treated both military and civilian casualties. Word spread that the valley was being held and that help was still coming from above. One mother who had lost her husband earlier in the campaign stood in line for rations with her 2 small children and spoke quietly to the soldier distributing food. She told him that her husband had believed the army would return one day. The soldier, who had himself lost friends on the long roads of the earlier retreat, simply nodded and gave her an extra measure of rice without being asked. The gesture was small, yet it carried the weight of everything both of them had endured and everything they still hoped might be possible. The Japanese attacks continued with the same determination that had marked the entire offensive, yet the defenders noticed a gradual change in their character. The assaults became less coordinated, less supported by artillery that was itself running short of shells. Tanaka's unit was ordered forward again and again, each time with fewer men and with less certainty that the attack would achieve anything beyond adding more names to the lists of the missing. He saw officers who had once spoken of inevitable victory now speaking only of duty and of the need to keep pressing even when every instinct said the position was too strong. The contrast between the two sides grew sharper with every passing week. Inside the ring, men who had been exhausted by the initial encirclement found their strength returning as supplies and reinforcements arrived. Outside the ring, men who had begun the offensive with confidence found their strength draining away with every failed attack and every day without adequate food. Sergeant Singh felt that shift most clearly in the men around him. The young sepoy who had once stared at the sky with hollow eyes now moved with a steadier purpose. He checked his weapon without being told. He helped newer arrivals learn the ground. When Singh spoke to him about the future, the sepoy answered with a quiet confidence that had not been there before the airdrops began. Singh himself wrote another letter to his wife during a lull between attacks. He told her about the planes that came even in bad weather, about the way the men around him had begun to believe they could hold, and about the small acts of care that kept appearing even in the middle of constant pressure. He did not promise that the siege would end soon. He simply told her that they were still fighting and that the army outside the ring was still fighting for them. That knowledge, he wrote, made all the difference. The Japanese command eventually recognized that the offensive had become a trap of its own making. The forces committed to Impol could not be sustained through the monsoon, and the British positions inside the ring showed no sign of collapsing. Tanaka's unit was ordered to pull back from one forward position after another, each withdrawal leaving more ground to the defenders and more bodies along the tracks that led back toward the Chindwin. He walked with the survivors of his section and tried not to count how many faces were missing. The spirit his commanders had invoked at the beginning of the gamble had not been enough to overcome the distance, the weather, and the simple fact that an army that cannot be supplied cannot win. Tanaka did not speak these thoughts aloud. He simply kept walking, because stopping would have meant accepting that everything they had endured had been for nothing. Inside the perimeter, the realization that the tide had turned came gradually rather than in a single dramatic moment. The Japanese attacks grew weaker and less frequent. The airdrops continued without interruption. Fresh units arrived and took their places in the line while tired formations were finally given rest. Singh stood on the same rise where he had first watched the planes appear and looked out across ground. That was still contested but no longer felt like a trap closing around them. The ring that had once seemed so tight had become something else entirely. It had become a position from which the defenders could strike outward when the time was right. The knowledge that they had not been abandoned, that an entire system of support had reached them when every road was cut, had changed the way they thought about what was still possible. The emotional power of that realization stayed with the men long after the siege was lifted. They had lived through months of bombardment and shortage while watching the enemy outside their positions grow weaker with every passing day. They had seen the revolutionary difference that air supply could make when ground routes were denied. They had discovered that calm leadership and steady reinforcement could turn a potential disaster into a position of strength. And they had done it together, sharing what little they had and refusing to let the isolation of encirclement become the isolation of despair. The lessons of those months would shape every operation that followed. They would shape the way the army thought about logistics, about reinforcement, and about the simple truth that an army which takes care of its people can endure almost anything. The story of how an encircled force held its ground and turned a Japanese gamble into their own trap is one of those hidden chapters that reveal the true nature of modern warfare and human resilience. These months inside the Iron Ring contain overlooked acts of endurance and the quiet power of logistics that rarely make the main narratives. If these accounts of the men and women who held Impol while the sky itself became their lifeline have moved you, I warmly invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, hidden heroes, and the overlooked chapters of history that rarely make it into the main narratives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the Japanese finally withdrew from the approaches to Impol, the valley that had felt like a trap for so many weeks became the launching point for the next phase of the campaign. The men who had held the ring walked out onto ground that was no longer under constant threat, and they carried with them the knowledge that they had survived something that should have broken them. They had learned that air supply could sustain an army where ground routes failed. They had learned that reinforcement and rest could restore strength even in the middle of a siege. And they had learned that the simple fact of not being abandoned could change everything about how men face the worst that war can offer. Those lessons, earned in mud and hunger and the steady drone of aircraft overhead, became part of the quiet foundation on which the larger victory would be built. The Iron Ring had held. The Japanese gamble had failed. And the army that had once retreated across these same hills was now ready to move forward with a confidence that no amount of earlier defeat could erase. The monsoon rains came as they always did, turning every track into a river of mud and every low-lying position into a shallow lake. Yet this year the sound of the downpour carried something the men of the 14th Army had not heard in a very long time, the distant but unmistakable noise of Japanese columns moving in the wrong direction. Sergeant Rajit Singh stood under the dripping edge of a canvas shelter and watched a column of his own men file past on a track that had become a stream. They were moving forward now, not digging in, not waiting for the next attack. The Japanese who had surrounded Impol and thrown themselves against the ridge at Kohima were pulling back, and the evidence of that retreat lay scattered along every path the section followed. Abandoned equipment half buried in mud. Bodies of men who had simply sat down and not risen again. Small groups of Japanese soldiers who surrendered without fight because hunger and disease had already done most of the work. Singh had seen defeat before, but this was different. This was not the organized withdrawal of a still coherent force. This was the slow disintegration of an army that had gambled everything on a single thrust and had run out of everything except the will to keep moving until it could move no more. The shift in morale inside the 14th Army did not arrive with speeches or celebrations. It arrived in small, ordinary moments that accumulated until even the most cautious soldier could no longer pretend the war had not changed. Singh's section found a Japanese supply dump that had been overrun and then abandoned. The crates that remained were mostly empty, but the few that still held rice or dried fish were passed around without anyone needing to give an order. Men who had lived on half rations for weeks ate until they were full for the first time in memory, and then they sat in the rain and looked at one another with expressions that were almost surprised. The same men who had written letters home filled with endurance and quiet fear now wrote letters that carried a different tone. They described the ground they were taking, the equipment they were finding, the sense that the long period of simply surviving had finally ended. Singh himself wrote to his wife that night, telling her that the men around him were still tired and still careful, but that something had lifted. He did not use the word victory. He simply said that they were moving forward now, and that the direction itself felt like proof that the worst was behind them. The Japanese soldiers who were retreating experienced the monsoon as the final blow to an already collapsing effort. Private Kenji Tanaka walked with what remained of his unit along tracks that had become impassable to anything except men on foot. The rain never stopped. Food had run out days earlier. The sick and wounded who could not keep up were left behind with whatever water could be spared, and the column grew smaller with every mile. Tanaka had stopped counting the days since the last proper meal. He had stopped expecting orders that made sense. The only thing that remained was the habit of putting one foot in front of the other and the faint hope that somewhere ahead there might still be a position that could be held. When his section encountered a small British patrol that had pushed too far forward, the fight was brief and one-sided. Most of the Japanese soldiers simply dropped their weapons and sat in the mud. Tanaka was among those who were taken prisoner. He did not resist. He had already used up every reserve of resistance during the long approach to Impol and the even longer retreat from it. Inside the advancing Allied columns, the contrast was almost painful. Supply columns moved forward on tracks that had been improved by engineers who now had the time and the resources to do their work properly. Medical teams followed close behind the leading units, treating wounds that would have been fatal only weeks earlier. Air support appeared overhead whenever it was needed, not as a desperate lifeline but as a normal part of operations. Singh watched a flight of fighters sweep low over a Japanese position that was still offering resistance and felt no triumph, only a quiet recognition that the balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The army that had once fought with its back to the wall was now fighting with its face toward the enemy, and the difference was visible in every movement and every decision. The educational truth that emerged from those weeks was simple and often overlooked in stories that focus only on the drama of battle. The monsoon did not stop the Japanese retreat. It simply made that retreat more costly and more final. The same rains that turned tracks into rivers also prevented the Japanese from reorganizing or bringing forward what little supply remained. Meanwhile, the 14th Army, sustained by the administrative systems that Slim had built during the months of rebuilding, could afford to move more slowly and more deliberately. They did not need to risk everything on a reckless pursuit. They could clear each position methodically, bring up supplies, rest tired units, and keep the pressure on an enemy who had already lost the ability to respond. That difference in administration and supply turned a tactical victory at Impol and Kohima into a strategic collapse that the Japanese could not recover from. Small moments of humanity continued to appear even in the middle of the retreat and the advance. Singh's section came across a small group of Japanese wounded who had been left behind by their own unit. The men were too weak to fight and too far gone to be moved. One of the British soldiers in the section shared his water bottle without being asked, and another used a field dressing on a wound that had gone untreated for days. The gestures did not change the outcome for the wounded men, but they happened because the men who made them had not yet lost the habit of seeing other human beings even when those human beings wore a different uniform. Singh watched the exchange without comment. He had seen too much to be surprised by either cruelty or kindness anymore. He simply made sure his own men were cared for and kept moving, because the only way to honor what they had endured was to finish the job they had been given. The quiet satisfaction that settled over the 14th Army was not the loud triumph of armies that have swept all before them. It was the deeper satisfaction of men who had been tested to the limit and had not broken. They had lived through the long retreat, the failed offensives, the months of rebuilding that had felt invisible to everyone except themselves, and the desperate defense of positions that should have fallen. Now they were walking forward on ground that had once been enemy territory, and the simple fact of that direction carried more meaning than any captured flag or any official announcement. Singh felt it most clearly when he sat with his section during a brief halt and listened to the men talk. They still spoke of home and of the families waiting for them. They still carried the private grief of friends who would not be going back. But the tone had changed. There was less resignation and more quiet certainty that the war, while far from over, had finally turned in their favor. The Japanese who survived the retreat carried a different kind of knowledge. Tanaka, after being processed as a prisoner, sat in a camp and tried to understand how an offensive that had begun with such confidence had ended in starvation and capture. He did not blame his commanders in any way he could put into words. He simply recognized that the spirit they had trusted had met a force that could not be overcome by spirit alone. The British and Indian soldiers who had once seemed so easy to defeat had learned how to fight the jungle, how to sustain themselves when cut off, and how to turn an enemy's overextension into their own advantage. That recognition did not come with bitterness. It came with the exhausted acceptance of a man who had given everything and had still been found wanting by circumstances larger than any individual courage. The monsoon turned, and with it turned the entire campaign. The 14th Army that had once been written off as a defeated and forgotten force had become something else entirely. It had become an army that understood its own strength, that had learned the hard lessons of jungle warfare through suffering and through the patient work of rebuilding, and that now moved forward with a confidence that no amount of earlier defeat could erase. The men who had held Impol and Kohima and who now followed the retreating Japanese did not need speeches to tell them what had changed. They saw it in the supply columns that kept up with them. They felt it in the medical care that reached them when they were wounded. They heard it in the tone of the letters they wrote home. And they carried it with them into every position they cleared and every track they followed through the rain. The courage and endurance that turned the monsoon from an enemy into an ally for the 14th Army deserve to be honored in ways that go beyond maps and casualty lists. These are the stories of men who survived the worst the jungle and the enemy could offer and who then found the strength to move forward when moving forward had once seemed impossible. If these accounts of the moment when hope returned and the tide finally turned have moved you, then perhaps you would like to hold a tangible reminder of that courage close. There are hand-picked World War II memorabilia and thoughtful books about the China-Burma-India theater available through Amazon, along with the powerful film Midway streaming on Prime Video, each one a way to honor the courage of all who fought across the Asian theater. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The pursuit continued through the rain and the mud, cautious and deliberate, because Slim understood that the victory at Impol and Kohima would only be complete if it was not thrown away by overreaching in conditions that still favored the defender. The Japanese who had gambled on a single great thrust had lost that gamble, and the army they had hoped to destroy was now the one that held the initiative. For the men who had lived through the entire arc, from the long retreat to the desperate defense to this first cautious advance, the change was not yet a matter of celebration. It was a matter of recognition. They had been tested. They had endured. And now, for the first time since the war had come to Burma, they were the ones moving forward while the enemy fell back. That simple reversal carried more weight than any number of captured positions or any official declaration of victory. It meant that the suffering had not been wasted. It meant that the lessons learned in defeat had become the foundation for something stronger. And it meant that the army that had once been forgotten was now the army that would decide what happened next in the green hills and valleys that had once seemed to belong entirely to the enemy. In the darkness before dawn, the sound of transport planes grew from a distant hum into a roar that filled the sky, and for the men waiting on the ground below, the first gliders slipping silently through the night carried both hope and the certain knowledge that there would be no easy way back. The second Chindit expedition had been planned on a scale that dwarfed the first. Instead of long columns marching on foot across hundreds of miles, entire brigades would be flown deep behind Japanese lines in gliders and transport aircraft, establishing fortified strongholds from which they could harass enemy supply routes and support the broader Allied effort in northern Burma. The men chosen for this task had trained for months in the techniques of air landing and long-range penetration. They knew the risks. They knew that once the gliders touched down there would be no quick extraction if things went wrong. Yet they also carried the belief, instilled by their commanders and by the example of the earlier expedition, that small forces operating far behind the enemy could change the shape of a campaign. Lieutenant David Ellis sat in the cramped fuselage of a glider, his knees drawn up against his pack, and listened to the steady drone of the towing aircraft ahead. Around him other men sat in silence or spoke in low voices about the landing zones they had studied on maps and models. Ellis had volunteered for the Chindits after hearing stories of the first expedition's ability to appear where the Japanese least expected them. He had trained with the mules that would be flown in with later waves, learned how to secure equipment for glider landings, and accepted that this operation would test every limit of endurance he possessed. As the glider began its descent toward the jungle clearing codenamed Broadway, he felt the familiar mix of fear and determination that had accompanied every major step since he had joined the Special Force. The landing was rougher than the training exercises had prepared him for. The glider bounced once, then slewed sideways as one will caught in soft ground. Ellis braced himself, heard the sound of tearing fabric and splintering wood, and then everything went still. When he climbed out into the humid night air, he saw other gliders scattered across the clearing, some upright, some broken, and he understood immediately that the operation had begun with both success and cost. The establishment of the strongholds was a race against time and against the Japanese reaction. At Broadway, the first troops secured the perimeter while engineers worked to improve the landing strip for follow-up flights. Mules were unloaded from later gliders, snorting and stamping in the unfamiliar surroundings. Ellis moved among his men, checking equipment, assigning positions, and trying to impose some order on the chaos of a night landing in unknown country. A young soldier near him had been thrown against the side of the glider during the rough landing and was holding his arm at an awkward angle. Ellis helped him to the makeshift aid post that was already being set up and watched as a medical orderly splinted the injury by the light of a shielded lantern. The soldier thanked him quietly and returned to his section as soon as the splint was secure. There was no drama in the exchange, only the quiet assumption that everyone would do what was necessary because the alternative was to let the operation fail before it had truly begun. Farther north, in a completely different kind of operation, Merrill's marauders were approaching the vital airfield at Myitkyina after one of the most grueling marches in the history of American forces in the theater. The marauders had been trained for long-range penetration in jungle conditions, and they had already conducted several successful actions behind Japanese lines. Now they were part of a larger effort under General Stilwell to capture Myitkyina and reopen a land route to China. The Chinese divisions that fought alongside them brought their own strengths and their own limitations. The cooperation between American, Chinese, and later British forces was never smooth, yet the shared objective of cutting Japanese supply lines and linking with the air route over the hump created a fragile but real partnership. On the approach to Myitkyina, the marauders moved through some of the most difficult terrain they had yet encountered. Rain fell constantly. Leeches attached themselves to any exposed skin. Men who had already marched for weeks on short rations felt their strength draining away with every mile. General Frank Merrill himself collapsed from exhaustion and heart strain during the final stages of the approach, an event that underscored the human cost of pushing Special Operations forces to their absolute limits. The assault on the Myitkyina airfield was fierce and costly. Japanese defenders fought from well-prepared positions, and the attackers had to cross open ground under fire to reach the objective. American and Chinese soldiers advanced together, supporting one another in ways that had not always been possible in earlier operations. One Chinese company suffered heavy losses clearing a section of the perimeter, yet they held the ground they had taken until American reinforcements could consolidate the position. The airfield itself changed hands several times in the initial fighting before the Allies finally secured it. For the men who fought there, the capture was not a clean victory but a grinding struggle that left many too exhausted to celebrate. They dug in on the captured ground, treated their wounded as best they could, and waited for the reinforcements and supplies that would allow them to hold what they had taken. The price had been high, yet the airfield now offered the possibility of air support and eventual reinforcement that could change the entire northern campaign. Back at the Chindit strongholds, the pattern of operations settled into a rhythm of patrols, ambushes, and the constant defense of the fortified positions. Ellis led his platoon on several sorties against Japanese supply columns moving along tracks that the stronghold was meant to interdict. The work was dangerous and often thankless. Small groups would slip out at night, lay ambushes, and then withdraw before the Japanese could organize a response. Casualties mounted steadily. Disease took as many men as enemy fire. Yet the presence of the strongholds forced the Japanese to divert troops and resources that might otherwise have been used against the main Allied advances elsewhere. Ellis wrote a letter to his family during a brief lull between operations, describing the routine of life inside the perimeter without mentioning the constant tension or the growing list of men who would not be going home. He focused instead on the way the men around him continued to look after one another, sharing what little they had and refusing to let exhaustion or fear turn them against their own comrades. The human cost of these concurrent operations was visible in every exhausted face and every body that had to be left behind. Merrill's collapse was only the most visible example of what happened when men were pushed beyond the limits of endurance. In the Chindit strongholds, soldiers who had trained for months found themselves fighting not only the Japanese but also the jungle itself. Leeches, malaria, dysentery, and simple physical breakdown took a steady toll. Yet the same conditions also produced moments of extraordinary resilience and care. When one of Ellis's men was wounded during a patrol and could not walk, two of his comrades carried him back to the stronghold over several miles of difficult ground, refusing to leave him behind even when it would have been easier to do so. The wounded man survived, and the story of that carry spread through the perimeter as an example of the bond that had formed among men who had little in common except the decision to volunteer for this kind of war. The interracial cooperation that marked the northern operations was never perfect, yet it produced results that would have been impossible if each force had operated in isolation. Chinese soldiers fought with determination once they were properly supported and led. American special forces like the Marauders brought skills in long-range movement and small unit tactics that complemented the strengths of the larger Chinese formations. British Chindits operating from their strongholds provided intelligence and harassment that helped the overall effort. Stilwell's command was often abrasive, and tensions between the different nationalities sometimes flared, yet the shared objective of reopening a land route to China kept the coalition functioning. Men who had once viewed their allies with suspicion learned to rely on one another when the fighting was at its worst. That learning came at a cost, but it also created bonds that would influence how future coalition operations were planned in the theater. As the weeks passed, the strongholds and the captured airfield at Myitkyina began to change the strategic picture in northern Burma. Japanese supply lines were disrupted. Chinese forces received supplies and reinforcements that allowed them to press their own advances. The possibility of a land route to China, something that had seemed almost impossible only months earlier, began to take shape. Ellis and the men around him saw the results of their work in the increasing difficulty the Japanese had in moving troops and supplies through the areas the strongholds dominated. They also saw the cost in the growing number of empty places around the evening fires and in the quiet way men spoke of comrades who would not be returning. The operation had never been intended to be bloodless. It had been intended to achieve results that conventional forces could not achieve on their own, and in that narrow sense it succeeded. The price, however, was paid in the bodies and minds of men who had been asked to endure conditions that few armies in history had ever demanded of their soldiers. The raw, unfiltered reality of those glider landings in the darkness, the desperate fighting around Myitkyina, and the daily struggle to survive inside the strongholds lives in photographs and letters and fragments of footage that were never meant for ordinary viewing. If you want to see the unvarnished faces and moments that defined these concurrent operations in northern Burma, our exclusive Gumroad digital archive holds rare, uncensored photographs, personal letters, and raw footage from the Burma Campaign jungles that were simply too visceral and restricted for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the strongholds were eventually withdrawn or reinforced and when Myitkyina was finally secured after weeks of grinding combat, the men who had participated in both efforts returned to the larger war with a deeper understanding of what special operations could achieve and what they could cost. Ellis survived the campaign and later spoke of the glider landings and the patrols from the strongholds as the hardest thing he had ever done, yet also as the thing that had taught him the most about the limits of human endurance and the power of small groups to influence events far beyond their size. The marauders who fought for Myitkyina carried similar memories, along with the knowledge that their general had pushed himself to the point of collapse in order to stay with them until the objective was taken. The Chinese soldiers who fought alongside them had proven their willingness to pay a terrible price for the chance to reopen a route to their homeland. These were not clean victories. They were victories earned through suffering, through cooperation that was often imperfect, and through the refusal of ordinary men to accept that the jungle and the enemy could break them completely. The gliders that had slipped through the night sky at the beginning of the operation had carried more than soldiers and equipment. They had carried the possibility that a different kind of war could be fought in the green darkness, and the men who lived that possibility paid the price in full. The Irrawaddy flowed dark and wide under the night sky, and for the men in the small boats slipping across its surface the river was no longer just a barrier of water but the threshold between years of grinding attrition and the possibility that one carefully concealed stroke could change everything. Sergeant Rajit Singh gripped the side of the assault boat as it nosed into the current. Around him other men sat in tense silence, their weapons held ready, their eyes fixed on the far bank that was still only a darker shadow against the night. For weeks the 14th Army had been moving with deliberate misdirection. Columns had advanced toward Mandalay and the Shwebo Plain as if that were the main effort, drawing Japanese attention and reserves northward. Now, far to the south, for Corps was executing the real thrust. The crossing here was meant to be a surprise, and every man in the boat understood that surprise was the only thing standing between a successful lodgment and a slaughter on the open water. Singh thought of the letters he had written during the long months of rebuilding and defense, letters that had carried more hope than certainty. This crossing felt like the moment those hopes might finally be tested in open battle rather than desperate holding actions. The engineers had worked through the previous nights to prepare the crossing sites, marking channels, clearing obstacles, and positioning the small fleet of boats and rafts that would carry the first waves. Artillery and air support were ready to suppress known Japanese positions on the far bank, but everyone knew that the real test would come once the leading troops were ashore and the enemy realized what was happening. Singh's section was part of the first wave. As the boat reached the middle of the river, the current pulled harder, and the men leaned into their paddles or braced against the motion. A flare burst somewhere upstream, briefly illuminating the water and the low shapes of other boats. For a few seconds every man felt exposed, as if the entire Japanese army must be watching. Then the flare faded and the darkness returned, and the only sounds were the quiet splash of paddles and the distant murmur of the river against the banks. On the far shore the landing was met with scattered fire rather than the concentrated barrage that would have signaled complete discovery. Singh's section scrambled up the muddy bank and into the cover of trees and scrub that lined the river. They moved quickly to secure a small perimeter while follow-up waves came across behind them. The first hours were a blur of digging in, establishing contact with neighboring units, and listening for the sound of Japanese movement in the darkness. By first light the bridgehead was holding, though it remained shallow and vulnerable. Singh moved among his men, checking positions and sharing what little information had reached him. The deception appeared to be working. Japanese reserves that might have been rushed south were still committed farther north, and the crossing had achieved its first objective of getting a force across the great river without catastrophic loss. The advance inland was rapid and deliberately aggressive. Armored columns and motorized infantry pushed hard toward the town of Maiktala, the key air and supply hub that Slim had identified as the decisive objective. The Japanese command, still focused on the feint toward Mandalay, was slow to react in strength. By the time they understood that the main threat was coming from the south, the leading Allied units were already closing on Maiktala. Singh's section moved with one of the forward elements, sometimes riding on vehicles when the ground allowed, sometimes marching when tracks became impassable. The speed of the advance created its own kind of tension. Men who had grown used to the deliberate pace of jungle fighting now found themselves covering ground that would have taken days or weeks in earlier campaigns. There was exhilaration in the movement, but also the constant awareness that they were deep in enemy territory with limited forces and that any delay in reinforcement could turn the bold stroke into a dangerous isolation. The seizure of Maiktala itself was a sharp, violent affair. Japanese defenders fought from positions around the airfield and the town, but they were surprised by the speed and weight of the attack. Armored cars and tanks supported the infantry in a series of quick actions that secured the vital airfield and the surrounding high ground. Singh was part of the force that cleared one sector of the town, moving from building to building against resistance that was fierce in places and suddenly absent in others. In one house they found a small group of Japanese soldiers who had been left behind when their unit withdrew. The fight was brief and close. When it was over, Singh helped carry a wounded comrade to the aid post that was already being established near the airfield. The man was conscious and trying to joke about the speed of the advance, but his face was pale and his breathing shallow. Singh stayed with him until the medical orderly could take over, then returned to his section with the quiet understanding that the easy part of the operation was already over. The Japanese reaction, once it came, was furious and sustained. They recognized that the loss of Maiktala threatened to cut their forces in central Burma in two and to open the way for a rapid Allied advance southward. Counterattacks began almost immediately, supported by whatever artillery and air power could be brought to bear. The defenders of Maiktala found themselves in the position the Japanese had occupied at Impol months earlier, holding a vital hub while the enemy threw everything available against them. Singh's section was assigned to a sector on the northern edge of the position where the ground was more open and the threat of armored attack was constant. They dug deeper, laid mines, and prepared for the kind of close, grinding combat that had characterized so much of the earlier fighting. The difference now was that they held the initiative and the better supply position. Reinforcements and ammunition could still reach them, while the Japanese attacking forces were operating at the end of long and vulnerable lines. The defense of Meiktala tested every lesson the 14th Army had learned since the dark days of the retreat. Small unit leadership became decisive. When Japanese infantry supported by a few tanks pressed one section of the perimeter, it was the quick thinking of a junior officer and the steady fire of the men around him that broke the attack before it could penetrate. Singh found himself coordinating with neighboring units whose commanders he had never met before the operation began. The old rivalries and suspicions that had sometimes marked relations between different formations had largely disappeared under the pressure of a common fight. Men shared ammunition, information, and the simple reassurance that came from knowing that someone on either side was still holding. In the middle of one particularly heavy bombardment, Singh sat in a shallow trench with two soldiers from another unit who had been separated from their own command. They shared a cigarette and spoke of home in the brief intervals between explosions. When the barrage lifted, they returned to their positions without ceremony, each carrying the quiet knowledge that survival in this kind of battle depended on the willingness to treat the man next to you as a brother even when you had never known his name. The Japanese counterattacks continued for days, each one more desperate than the last as their commanders realized that the loss of Meiktala would be decisive. The defenders endured constant pressure, sleepless nights, and the steady drain of casualties. Yet they also sensed that the enemy was weakening. Abandoned equipment and the bodies of attackers left in front of the positions told their own story. The Japanese were throwing men into attacks they could no longer sustain, while the Allied position was being steadily reinforced from the air and from the bridgehead behind them. Singh wrote a short letter to his wife during one of the brief lulls, telling her that the fighting was hard but that the men around him believed they were winning. He did not describe the fear or the exhaustion. He simply said that they were holding a place that mattered and that he was proud of the way they were doing it. The letter was brief because there was little time and because some things could only be understood by those who had lived through the same days. The elation of having outwitted the enemy at the operational level was real but tempered by the cost. Slim's deception had worked brilliantly. The Japanese had been fixed in the north while the decisive blow fell far to the south. Yet the men who had executed that blow were now paying the price in blood and endurance. The capture and defense of Meiktala demonstrated in the clearest possible way what maneuver warfare could achieve when it was combined with sound intelligence, careful preparation, and the willingness to trust subordinate commanders to act boldly once the plan was in motion. It also showed the limits of even the most brilliant operational design. Victory still required men on the ground to hold what had been seized, and holding Meiktala demanded the same qualities of resilience and mutual care that had sustained the army through its earlier defeats. When the Japanese counterattacks finally slackened and the pressure on the perimeter eased, the men who had held Meiktala looked at one another with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. They had done what had been asked of them. They had crossed the great river in secret, driven deep into enemy territory, seized a vital objective, and then held it against everything the Japanese could throw at them. The operational art that had made the crossing possible had been matched by the tactical skill and human endurance that had made the defense possible. Singh stood on the edge of the position one evening as the light faded and watched a supply aircraft circling to land on the airfield they had fought so hard to keep. The sound of its engines was steady and reassuring, a reminder that the army behind them was still moving forward and that the isolation they had accepted when they crossed the Irrawaddy was no longer complete. The river that had once seemed so wide and so dangerous now lay behind them, crossed and secured. Ahead lay the open road to Mandalay and beyond it the possibility of ending the long campaign in Burma with something closer to victory than any of them had dared to hope for during the dark months of retreat and rebuilding. The brilliant crossing of the Irrawaddy and the seizure of Meiktala stand as one of the finest examples of operational maneuver in the entire Burma campaign, a moment when leadership, deception, and the courage of ordinary soldiers combined to turn the tide in central Burma. These are stories of strategic brilliance matched by human endurance that deserve to be remembered with care and honesty. If these accounts of the secret crossing and the desperate defense have moved you even a little, perhaps you would consider supporting the creation of these stories with a small tip on Ko-Fi, even just $1. so we can keep bringing these forgotten chapters of courage and suffering to light with the research and heart they require. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The success at Meiktala did not end the war in Burma, but it changed the character of what remained. The Japanese forces in central Burma were now split and increasingly desperate. The 14th Army had demonstrated that it could move with speed and surprise when conditions allowed, and that it could hold what it seized against determined counterattack. For the men who had crossed the Irrawaddy in the darkness and then fought to keep the ground they had taken, the experience became part of the quiet confidence that would carry them through the final months of the campaign. They had outthought and outfought an enemy who had once seemed unstoppable. They had done it not through reckless bravery alone, but through the combination of careful planning, bold execution, and the daily refusal to let one another down when everything around them was at its worst. That combination, proven on the banks of the Irrawaddy and in the streets and fields around Meiktala, was what would allow the 14th Army to finish the reconquest of Burma with a momentum that no one could have predicted during the long years of defeat and rebuilding. The spires of Mandalay rose above the plain like a memory of a kingdom that had once ruled these lands, and for the men advancing toward them the city was no longer just a military objective but a symbol of everything that had been lost and everything that might still be regained. Sergeant Ajit Singh moved with his section along a track that wound through low hills toward the outskirts of Mandalay. The success at Meiktala had opened the way north, and now XXXII Corps was driving hard to complete the destruction of Japanese forces in central Burma. Mandalay had been the ancient royal capital, a place of temples and palaces that carried deep meaning for the Burmese people and for every soldier who had fought across this country. Singh had heard the name spoken with reverence by Burmese civilians during the long retreat of 1942, and later with bitterness by those who had lived under Japanese occupation. Now the city lay ahead, and the men around him understood that taking it would mean more than capturing ground. It would mean returning a piece of Burma's own history to its people, even if those people viewed the returning army with complicated feelings. The fighting for Mandalay was fierce and close. Japanese defenders had turned parts of the city and the surrounding hills into strongpoints, using the old palace walls and the high ground to slow the advance. Singh's section was part of the force clearing one of the approaches through the outskirts. They moved from building to building, from one cluster of trees to the next, under fire that came from unexpected angles. The city itself seemed to fight back. Narrow streets and thick vegetation gave the defenders cover, while the attackers had to expose themselves to reach each new position. In one alley Singh came across a small group of Burmese civilians who had been sheltering in a half-ruined house. An old woman held a child against her side while two younger women watched the soldiers with expressions that were neither welcome nor open hostility, only a deep weariness born of too many years under one occupying force after another. Singh stopped his men, spoke quietly to the family in the few words of Burmese he had picked up, and made sure they had water before moving on. The encounter stayed with him. These were the people for whom the city was being liberated, yet their faces showed that liberation carried its own uncertainties. Inside Mandalay, the Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing the campaign. The old royal palace complex became a focal point of the battle. Its walls and courtyards, once symbols of Burmese sovereignty, were now turned into defensive positions. The fighting there was hand-to-hand in places, with soldiers from both sides moving through the same rooms and corridors where kings had once held court. Singh heard later from men who had been part of that assault that the contrast between the grandeur of the setting and the brutality of the combat had been almost unbearable. They had cleared room after room, sometimes finding Japanese soldiers who fought to the last and sometimes finding only the debris of a retreating force. When the palace area finally fell, the men who raised their own flags there did so with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. They had taken one of the most symbolically important places in Burma, yet they also knew that symbols alone did not end wars or heal the wounds occupation had left behind. Burmese civilians emerged from hiding as the fighting moved through their neighborhoods. Some came forward with cautious offers of help, guiding soldiers around booby traps or sharing what little food they had. Others stayed back, watching from doorways and windows, their expressions revealing the complex emotions of a people who had endured Japanese rule and now faced the return of British and Indian forces. One young Burmese man approached Singh's section after a particularly sharp exchange of fire. He spoke in careful English, explaining that his family had hidden in the hills during the worst of the Japanese occupation and had only recently returned to the city. He asked if the soldiers needed water or directions to the next strongpoint. Singh accepted the offer of water and thanked the man, then asked what he hoped would come after the fighting ended. The young man hesitated before answering. He said he wanted his country to be free, but he did not know what form that freedom would take or which army would ultimately decide its shape. Singh nodded without offering promises. He had seen enough of war to know that the answers to such questions would be worked out long after the last shot was fired. The symbolic weight of recapturing Mandalay reached beyond the immediate battlefield. For the Burmese people, the city represented a connection to their own history that Japanese occupation had tried to sever or reshape. For the soldiers of the 14th Army, many of whom had fought across Burma since the darkest days of 1942, taking Mandalay felt like a measure of justice for everything they had endured. Singh wrote to his wife that night, describing the city and the fighting without the bitterness that had marked his earlier letters. He told her that they had walked through streets where kings had lived and that the men around him had fought as if the place itself demanded their best effort. He did not write about the wary faces of the civilians or about the questions that hung in the air once the shooting stopped. Those were truths too large and too uncertain for a single letter, but they stayed with him as the advance continued. The Japanese resistance in Mandalay eventually collapsed under the weight of coordinated attacks from multiple directions. As the last strongpoints fell, more civilians came out of hiding. Some brought food to the soldiers who had cleared their streets. Others simply stood and watched, trying to understand what this new phase of their country's history would bring. Singh saw one old man walk slowly through a street that had been heavily fought over. The man stopped at the body of a Japanese soldier and looked at it for a long moment before moving on. There was no triumph in the gesture, only a quiet acknowledgement that another occupier had been driven out and that the cycle of foreign armies deciding Burma's fate might be nearing its end. Singh did not approach the man. He simply made sure his section kept moving and kept watching, because even in victory there were dangers in assuming that every civilian saw the same liberation they did. The liberation of Mandalay carried lessons that went beyond the military achievement. It showed how the recapture of a cultural and political heartland could shift the psychological balance of an entire campaign. Soldiers who had fought through anonymous jungle and anonymous towns found new energy in taking a place whose name carried meaning for the people they were fighting among. At the same time, the mixed reactions of Burmese civilians reminded every commander that military victory and political acceptance were not the same thing. The 14th Army had driven the Japanese from Mandalay, but the deeper questions of what would follow, independence, continued British influence, or some new arrangement, remained to be settled by the Burmese people themselves. Singh understood this in the way he had come to understand so much of the war, through the faces of the people he met rather than through any official statement. The old woman in the ruined house, the young man who had asked about the future, the old man who had paused beside a fallen enemy, each of them carried a piece of the larger truth that armies could liberate ground, but only people could decide what that liberation would ultimately mean. For the men who had fought their way into Mandalay, the city became part of their own story of the war. They had entered it as liberators and left it as men who had seen both the cost of occupation and the complicated nature of its end. Singh carried that understanding with him as his section moved on toward the next objective. The fighting was not over, and the road south still held dangers, but something had shifted. They had taken one of the places that mattered most to the people of Burma, and they had done it in a way that honored the human cost on all sides. That knowledge did not erase the exhaustion or the grief for friends who would never see home again. It simply gave the next steps a different weight. The weight of knowing that every position cleared and every town entered was part of a larger story that would continue long after the last soldier had left these hills and valleys. The liberation of Mandalay, with all its symbolic power and all the complex human emotions it stirred among both soldiers and civilians, stands as one of those moments when military success and deeper historical meaning briefly overlapped. These are the stories that reveal how the end of occupation carries both relief and uncertainty, and how ordinary people on all sides navigate the space between them. If these accounts of the fighting in the old capital and the wary hope in the faces of its people have stayed with you, I warmly invite you to join our Patreon community, where you can access uncensored extended episodes that explore these moments in greater depth, bonus podcasts with historians who have studied the human and political dimensions of liberation in Burma, raw video sections that show the terrain and the remnants of the battle, and a chance to connect with fellow history enthusiasts who believe the stories of the forgotten army deserve to be kept alive and examined together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the last pockets of resistance in Mandalay were cleared and the city began to return to some semblance of life, the 14th Army prepared to continue its advance. The capture of the ancient capital had been more than a military victory. It had been a statement that the long retreat of 1942 was truly over and that the reconquest of Burma was moving toward its conclusion. For the Burmese people who had lived through Japanese occupation, the return of Allied forces brought the possibility of peace, but also the reminder that their country's future would still be shaped by decisions made far from their own villages and cities. For the soldiers who had fought their way in, Mandalay became another marker on a journey that had begun in defeat and was now moving, however slowly and at whatever cost, towards something that looked more like victory. Singh and the men around him did not know what the final weeks and months would bring. They knew only that they had taken a place that mattered to the people they were fighting among, and that in doing so they had added one more layer to the complicated story of liberation, occupation, and the human price that both always exact. The spires of Mandalay would stand long after the last soldier had moved on. What the people who lived beneath those spires would make of the freedom that followed was a question no army could answer for them. The clouds were already building on the horizon when the leading columns turned south from Mandalay, and for every man in those columns the sky itself had become the enemy they had to outrun. Sergeant Rajit Singh drove the lead vehicle in his section's small convoy as it pushed down the road toward Rangoon. The success at Maiktala and the capture of Mandalay had broken the back of organized Japanese resistance in central Burma, but the monsoon was coming and everyone knew what that meant. Once the rains arrived in full force, the roads would turn to rivers of mud, supply columns would bog down, and the momentum that had carried the 14th Army this far could be lost in a matter of days. Slim had made the decision to exploit the victory without pause. For Corps was driving south along the Sitang Valley with every vehicle that could be kept running, while planners in the rear prepared a bold combined operation to seize Rangoon itself before the weather closed in. Singh had seen the maps and heard the briefings. He understood the stakes. If they reached the capital before the monsoon, the campaign could end with something close to total victory. If the rains caught them first, the Japanese might still have time to reorganize and the war in Burma could drag on for another season. The advance was relentless. Vehicles moved day and night, stopping only when mechanical failure or enemy rearguards forced a halt. Singh's section had been reinforced with additional trucks and a few armored cars, and they pushed forward with a speed that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. The men were exhausted. Many had not slept properly since the crossing of the Irrawaddy. Yet the knowledge that they were finally racing toward the end of the long campaign kept them moving. When a truck broke down, the men around it worked through the night to repair it or strip it for parts so the column could continue. When Japanese rearguards tried to slow them with mines or ambushes, the response was quick and overwhelming. Singh watched a young driver who had joined the unit only weeks earlier calmly steer around a crater left by a mine, then accelerate again as if nothing had happened. The driver later told him that he simply wanted to get home, and that every mile south was a mile closer to that possibility. Singh nodded and said nothing, because the same thought lived in his own chest. While the ground columns raced south, planners in Calcutta and at Slim's headquarters finalized Operation Dracula. The original plan for an amphibious assault on Rangoon had been shelved earlier because of resource shortages, but now the situation had changed. Japanese forces were crumbling, and the chance existed to seize the capital with a sudden combined airborne and seaborne blow before the monsoon made such an operation impossible. The decision was made under intense time pressure. Every day of delay brought the rains closer. Every delay also gave the Japanese more time to prepare defenses or to evaluate the city in an orderly way. The planners worked through the nights, coordinating airdrops, naval movements, and the timing of the ground advance so that all the pieces would arrive together. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble built on the confidence that had grown through every previous success since the dark days of 1942. The airborne element of Dracula went in first. Paratroopers and glider troops descended on key points around Rangoon while the seaborne force approached from the sea. Singh heard the news over the radio in his vehicle as his column pushed south. The landings had met almost no resistance. Japanese forces in the city had already begun to withdraw northward, leaving only rearguards to delay the Allied approach. The capital was falling with far less fighting than anyone had expected. Singh felt a surge of something close to disbelief when the message came through. After all the years of retreat and rebuilding, after Impul and Kohima and the long drive from the Irrawaddy, Rangoon was being taken almost without a battle. He stopped the vehicle for a moment and looked at the men around him. Some were grinning. Others simply sat in silence, too tired to react. One young soldier pulled out a crumpled photograph of his family and stared at it for a long time before carefully folding it again and putting it away. The moment passed, and the column moved on. As the ground forces neared Rangoon, they encountered more and more evidence of the Japanese evacuation. Abandoned vehicles, supply dumps that had been hastily destroyed, and small groups of stragglers who surrendered without fight. Singh's section was among the first to reach the outskirts of the city. They moved cautiously through streets that were strangely quiet after the fighting they had expected. Civilians began to appear in doorways and at windows, watching the soldiers with expressions that mixed relief and caution. Some came forward with water or fruit. Others simply watched, waiting to see what this new occupation would bring. Singh stopped to speak with an older man who stood outside a small shop. The man said he had lived through the Japanese arrival in 1942 and the harsh years that followed. He asked if the British would stay this time or if they would leave again once the fighting was over. Singh answered honestly that he did not know. He said only that the soldiers around him were tired of war and wanted to go home, and that perhaps the Burmese people would finally be allowed to decide their own future. The old man nodded slowly and offered him a cup of tea. Singh accepted it and drank it standing in the street while his men secured the next block. Inside Rangoon, the scenes of liberation were both joyful and restrained. People who had hidden or endured in silence during the Japanese years came out into the streets. Some cheered. Others simply stood and watched the columns pass, their faces showing the exhaustion of long occupation rather than celebration. Singh saw a young woman holding a child and crying quietly as the soldiers moved past her house. He did not approach her. He simply made sure his section kept moving and kept watching, because even in victory there were dangers in assuming that every face reflected the same emotion. The city itself showed the scars of war and occupation. Buildings were damaged, streets were cluttered with debris, and the port facilities that had once made Rangoon one of the busiest in Asia were in poor condition. Yet the simple fact that the capital had been reached before the monsoon turned the entire campaign into something closer to a decisive victory than anyone had dared to predict only weeks earlier. The monsoon arrived almost exactly on schedule, just hours after the last major elements of the seaborne force had landed. The rain came down in sheets that turned every unpaved road into a river and every low-lying area into a lake. Supply columns that had been racing south now found themselves struggling through mud that swallowed vehicles up to their axles. But the city had been taken. The port was in Allied hands. The Japanese who had evacuated Rangoon were now retreating northward into country that would soon be as difficult for them as it had once been for the 14th Army. Singh stood under the dripping edge of a canvas shelter on the edge of the city and watched the rain fall. He thought of all the letters he had written since the long retreat of 1942, letters that had carried fear and endurance and, more recently, a growing sense of purpose. He thought of his wife and son waiting in Punjab, and of the men around him who had survived the same journey. For the first time in years, the future felt closer than the past. The race against the rains had been won through a combination of bold planning, relentless exploitation on the ground, and the simple fact that the Japanese had been too weakened by earlier defeats to mount an effective defense of Rangoon. The decision to launch Operation Dracula at the last possible moment had paid off because the ground columns had kept the pressure on and because the enemy had already begun to collapse. Yet the victory had come at a cost. Men had driven themselves and their vehicles beyond reasonable limits to reach the city in time. Wounded soldiers had been left in makeshift aid posts along the route because there had been no time to evaluate them properly. The human price of rapid exploitation was visible in every exhausted face and every vehicle that had been pushed until it could go no farther. For the people of Rangoon, the arrival of Allied forces brought the possibility of peace after years of harsh occupation, but it also brought the reminder that their country's future would still be decided by forces larger than any single city. Some welcomed the soldiers openly. Others remained cautious, waiting to see whether this liberation would lead to genuine independence or simply a return to the old order. Singh saw both reactions in the days that followed. He saw children running alongside the columns and laughing. He saw older men and women standing in doorways with expressions that were impossible to read. He understood that the military campaign was ending, but the political one was only beginning. That understanding did not diminish the relief he felt at having reached the capital before the monsoon. It simply placed that relief in its proper context, as one chapter in a much longer story that the Burmese people would have to write for themselves. The race had been won. Rangoon was in Allied hands. The monsoon had arrived too late to save the Japanese position in southern Burma. For Sergeant Rajit Singh and the men who had driven south with him, the moment marked the end of one long phase of the war and the beginning of whatever would come next. They had outrun the rains. They had reached the city that had once seemed impossibly far away. And they had done it together, through a combination of endurance, small acts of mutual care, and the quiet belief that the suffering of earlier years had not been wasted. That belief would carry them through whatever remained of the campaign, and it would stay with them long after they had left Burma behind. The rapid dash south and the last-minute launch of Operation Dracula represent one of the finest examples of exploitation and combined planning in the entire Burma campaign, a moment when timing, logistics, and human endurance combined to deliver victory just ahead of the monsoon. These are stories of soldiers who pushed themselves past every reasonable limit and of civilians who navigated the uncertain space between occupation and liberation. If these accounts of the race against the rains and the fall of Rangoon have moved you, I warmly invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter, where you will receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into espionage, hidden heroes, and the overlooked chapters of history that rarely make it into the main narratives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the days after the monsoon settled in, the men who had reached Rangoon began the slow process of resting, reorganizing, and preparing for whatever task would come next. Some would be sent north to help clear the remaining Japanese forces. Others would begin the long journey home. Singh sat with his section under the shelter of a damaged building and listened to the rain. The war in Burma was not entirely over, but the end was now visible in a way it had never been before. They had outrun the weather. They had taken the capital. And they had done it in a way that honored every mile they had marched since the long retreat of 1942. That knowledge did not erase the cost or the uncertainty that still lay ahead. It simply gave them something they had not possessed for a very long time, the quiet certainty that the direction they were facing was finally the right one. The news came not with parades or fanfare but in quiet radio messages passed from man to man, and for the soldiers who had fought across these hills and valleys the sudden absence of an enemy felt stranger than any battle they had endured. Sergeant Rajit Singh sat on an ammunition box outside a damaged building on the edge of Rangoon and listened to the low voices of the men around him as the word spread. The Japanese had surrendered. The war that had taken so many of their friends and had reshaped every life in the 14th Army was over. Singh had imagined this moment many times during the long years since the retreat from Burma in 1942. He had pictured relief, perhaps even joy. What he felt instead was a quiet, heavy stillness, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning and he was still waiting to find his balance. Around him men spoke in fragments. Some asked what would happen next. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the ground or at the sky that no longer carried the threat of enemy aircraft. Singh folded the letter he had been writing to his wife and slipped it into his pocket. There would be time later to finish it, to try to put into words what this ending actually meant. The Japanese soldiers who had fought so hard and so long across Burma now faced a different kind of ending. Many had already begun to surrender in small groups even before the formal announcement reached the front lines. They came out of the hills and the jungles with their weapons stacked or broken, their faces hollowed by months of hunger and defeat. Some carried the same quiet fatalism that had carried them through years of war. Others looked lost, as if the sudden collapse of everything they had believed in had left them without any map for what came next. Singh watched one such group being processed by a British unit near the city. The Japanese soldiers stood in a ragged line, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes fixed on the ground. A young British officer moved among them, offering water and cigarettes with the same mechanical courtesy he might have shown any group of prisoners. When one of the Japanese men stumbled from exhaustion, a Gurkha rifleman stepped forward without being ordered and steadied him. The moment passed without words, yet it stayed with Singh as an example of how even the end of fighting did not immediately erase the habits of care that men had learned in order to survive. For the soldiers of the Indian National Army who had fought alongside the Japanese, the surrender brought an even more complicated reckoning. Many had been captured earlier in the campaign and were already in Allied hands. Others surrendered with the Japanese units they had been attached to. Their fate would be decided not only by military law but by the political storms that were already gathering in India. The trials that would later take place in Delhi's Red Fort became something far larger than individual cases of alleged treason. They became symbols of resistance against British rule, moments when men who had chosen to fight for Indian independence alongside an enemy were transformed in the public imagination into martyrs and patriots. Singh had known some of these men in earlier years, before the war had split loyalties so sharply. He had shared meals and conversations with Indian soldiers who later found themselves on the other side of the battlefield. Now, as the fighting ended, he wondered what would become of them and what their choices would mean for the India they all still called home. In Burma itself, the end of the war arrived with a mixture of relief and uncertainty that touched every community. Burmese civilians who had endured the harsh years of Japanese occupation emerged into a landscape that was both liberated and unsettled. Some welcomed the returning Allied forces with open relief. Others watched with the same cautious calculation they had learned during the occupation, waiting to see whether this new presence would bring genuine freedom or simply another chapter of foreign decisions about their country's future. Aung San, who had once allied with the Japanese in the hope of ending British rule, had already begun the pragmatic pivot that would define the final phase of Burma's path to independence. He had negotiated with Mountbatten and with British officials even while the fighting continued, shifting his position as the realities of Japanese defeat became clear. For many Burmese, this shift represented both political skill and moral ambiguity. Aung San had collaborated with one occupier to fight another, and now he was negotiating with the returning power to secure a future for his people. The courage required for that navigation was real, even if the choices it demanded were never clean. Singh encountered some of these complexities directly in the weeks after the surrender. His unit was assigned to occupation duties in the countryside north of Rangoon, helping to secure roads and maintain order while the larger political questions were sorted out in Rangoon and in London. One afternoon he spoke with a Burmese village headman who had lived through both the Japanese arrival and the Allied return. The man described how Japanese forces had taken food and labor without compensation, how resistance had been met with harsh reprisals, and how the promise of Asian liberation had quickly soured into another form of foreign control. He also spoke of his hope that this time the British would keep their earlier promises of self-government. Singh listened without offering answers he did not have. He had fought for an empire that was already beginning to unravel, and he understood that the end of one war was often only the beginning of another kind of struggle. When the headman asked what Singh hoped for his own country, Singh answered simply that he wanted to go home to his wife and son and to find work that did not require carrying a rifle. The headman nodded as if that answer made sense, and they sat together for a while in the shade of a tree while the rain began to fall again. The moral ambiguities of wartime alliances lingered long after the guns fell silent. Japanese soldiers who had believed they were fighting for a greater Asia found themselves prisoners in camps where they faced their own reckoning with defeat. INA soldiers who had chosen to fight against the British Indian Army now faced trials that would test the very definition of loyalty and treason. Burmese leaders like Aung San had to navigate between the memory of collaboration and the practical need to secure independence from the power they had once opposed. None of these choices were simple, and none of them erased the human cost of the years that had come before. Singh thought often of the men he had known on both sides of the lines. He thought of the Japanese soldier he had killed in close combat during the defense of Kohima, and of the INA men he had heard about who had died believing they were striking a blow for freedom. He thought of the Burmese civilians who had helped both sides at different times simply to survive. The war had forced ordinary people into positions where every choice carried consequences that no one could fully foresee. The end of the fighting did not resolve those consequences. It simply made space for them to be lived out in a different register. For the men of the 14th Army, the surrender brought the possibility of going home, but it also brought the slow realization that home itself might have changed. Singh wrote to his wife with news of the end of the war and with questions about what life might look like now that the fighting was over. He did not pretend that the years of separation and danger could be erased by a single announcement. He simply told her that he was still alive and that he wanted to see their son grow up in a world that was quieter than the one he had known. Around him, other men spoke of the same hopes and the same uncertainties. Some planned to stay in the army. Others talked of returning to villages and cities they had left years earlier, unsure of what work or what welcome would be waiting for them. The quiet resilience that had carried them through the jungle and the monsoon and the long retreats now had to be turned toward a future that no training or briefing could prepare them for. The personal courage required to navigate the end of empire and the end of war showed itself in small, ordinary ways. A British officer who had fought alongside Indian troops for years quietly advocated for fair treatment of INA prisoners in his sector. A Burmese translator who had worked with Japanese forces during the occupation risked his own safety to help Allied investigators locate hidden supply dumps. A Japanese medical orderly continued to care for wounded prisoners even after the formal surrender, because the habit of tending the injured had become stronger than any political allegiance. These were not the actions that made headlines or shaped treaties. They were the actions that allowed individuals to remain human in the middle of systems that had demanded they choose sides and accept the consequences. Singh saw such moments repeatedly in the weeks after the guns fell silent, and each one reminded him that the war's true legacy would be measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in the ways ordinary people chose to treat one another once the fighting had stopped. The surrender did not bring immediate peace to Burma or to India. Political negotiations, trials, and the slow process of demobilization stretched on for months and years. Yet for the men who had carried rifles across these landscapes since 1942, the moment when the news arrived marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever would come next. Singh stood outside that damaged building in Rangoon and watched the rain fall on a city that was no longer under threat of attack. He thought of the long road from the retreat to this place, of the friends who had not made it, of the civilians who had endured more than any soldier could fully understand. He thought of his wife and son waiting across the sea, and of the home he hoped to build with them. The war was over. The choices that had been forced by war remained. And the task of living with those choices, of finding a way forward that honored both the courage and the cost, had only just begun. The complex aftermath of the Burma Campaign, with its moral ambiguities, its political reckonings, and its quiet acts of human courage, deserves to be remembered with the same care we give to the battles themselves. These are the stories of men and women who had to navigate the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. If these accounts of the moment when the guns fell silent and the harder work of peace began have moved you, I warmly invite you to join our Patreon community, where you can access uncensored extended episodes that explore these moments in greater depth, bonus podcasts with historians who have studied the human and political dimensions of empire's end in Asia, raw video sections that show the landscapes and the faces of those who lived through them, and a chance to connect with fellow history enthusiasts who believe the stories of the forgotten army deserve to be kept alive and examined together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the months that followed, the 14th Army began to dissolve as men were demobilized and sent home in waves. Singh was among those who eventually boarded a ship that carried him back across the sea he had crossed years earlier as a young soldier. He carried with him the letters he had written and the memories he could not leave behind. He carried also the knowledge that the war had changed him in ways he was still learning to name. The Burma Campaign had begun in defeat and had ended in victory, but the victory had come at a price that no map or casualty list could fully capture. It had come through the endurance of men who refused to break, through the care they showed one another in the worst of circumstances, and through the quiet courage of those who had to choose new paths once the old ones had been destroyed. That price, and that courage, would shape the India and the Burma that emerged from the ruins of empire. And it would shape the lives of men like Sergeant Rajit Singh long after the last ship had left Rangoon and the last echo of the guns had faded into the green hills they had fought so hard to cross. When the last ships carried the last soldiers away from the shores of Burma, the green hills and valleys fell silent, and for the men who had fought across them the real work of understanding what they had lived through was only beginning. Sergeant Rajit Singh stood on the deck of a troopship as it pulled away from Rangoon and watched the coastline fade into the haze. He had arrived in this country years earlier as part of an army that was still reeling from defeat. He was leaving now as part of an army that had turned that defeat into one of the most remarkable recoveries in the history of modern warfare. Around him other men leaned on the rail or sat in small groups, speaking in low voices or simply staring at the water. Some carried the quiet satisfaction of having survived. Others carried the heavier knowledge that survival had come at a price no one could fully measure. Singh thought of the letters he had written to his wife over those years, letters that had traced a path from fear and endurance to a hard-won confidence. He thought of the friends whose names he would never again call across a campfire. He thought of the civilians he had met along the way, the Burmese families who had endured occupation and war and who now faced an uncertain peace. The ship moved steadily through the swells, carrying him toward a home that felt both familiar and changed, and he knew that the Burma Campaign would travel with him long after the coastline had disappeared. The human cost of that campaign stretched across every nation that had sent its sons to fight in these jungles. On the Allied side alone, the 14th Army suffered tens of thousands of casualties from combat, disease, and exhaustion. The Japanese losses were even higher, with entire divisions shattered by the combination of Allied resistance, supply failure, and the monsoon. Chinese, American, and other forces that had operated in the northern sectors added their own toll. Behind the numbers lay the quieter arithmetic of lives interrupted or ended, of families who would never again hear a familiar voice, of men who returned home carrying wounds that no hospital could fully heal. Singh had seen too much of that cost to speak of victory in the simple language of flags raised over captured ground. He had carried wounded comrades and buried friends. He had watched civilians suffer under successive occupations. He had felt his own body pushed to limits he had not known existed. The victory, when it finally came, arrived wrapped in grief as much as in relief. Yet the achievement of the multinational force that became known as the Forgotten Army remained extraordinary by any measure. Soldiers from Britain, India, Africa, Nepal, and other corners of the empire had learned to fight and win in some of the most difficult terrain on earth. They had absorbed the lessons of early defeat and turned those lessons into a doctrine of jungle warfare that emphasized health, supply, realistic training, and leadership that treated every soldier as a human being worth preserving. They had sustained themselves through air power when ground routes failed. They had held when holding seemed impossible and advanced when advancing required crossing rivers and seizing strongholds against a determined enemy. Singh had been part of that transformation. He had seen units that once broke under pressure become formations that could endure encirclement at Impol, hold the ridge at Kohima, cross the Irrawaddy in secret, and race the monsoon to Rangoon. The army that had once been written off as defeated had become the force that delivered the largest single defeat the Japanese land army suffered in the entire war. William Slim, the man who had inherited that broken force and rebuilt it into something formidable, carried his own quiet legacy forward from those years. He had led with a combination of professional skill and genuine care for his men that earned him the nickname Uncle Bill. After the war, he rose to the rank of Field Marshal, served as Governor-General of Australia, and wrote one of the most respected memoirs of any commander from the conflict. Yet those who had served under him remembered not the titles but the way he had moved among exhausted troops after long marches, the way he had insisted on realistic training rather than parade ground formality, and the way he had refused to treat soldiers as expendable numbers on a map. Singh had seen Slim only from a distance during the campaign, but the effect of his leadership had been visible in every improved supply system, every better medical post, and every small unit commander who now understood that taking care of his men was not a distraction from the mission but the heart of it. For the people of Burma, the end of the war brought independence in 1948, yet that independence arrived amid civil conflict and political upheaval that would shape the country for decades. Aung San, who had navigated the dangerous path from collaboration with the Japanese to negotiation with the returning British, did not live to see the full realization of the independence he had sought. His assassination in 1947 removed one of the few figures who might have bridged the deep divisions that emerged once the common enemy was gone. The Burma that emerged from the campaign was free of foreign occupation but not yet at peace with itself. Singh thought of the Burmese civilians he had met during the final months, the families who had shared water or directions, the village headmen who had asked what the future might hold. He wondered whether the independence they had hoped for would bring the stability and dignity they deserved, or whether the scars of war and occupation would take generations to heal. The campaign had liberated their country from one set of foreign rulers, but it had not delivered the peaceful future that so many had imagined during the darkest days. The reasons this theater became known as the Forgotten War are many and intertwined. The main strategic focus of the Allies remained on the defeat of Germany in Europe and the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Resources and attention flowed to those theaters in greater volume, and the battles fought in the jungles of Burma received less coverage in newspapers and newsreels back home. The 14th Army itself adopted the nickname Forgotten Army with a mixture of pride and rueful humor, acknowledging that their achievements were often overshadowed by more dramatic victories elsewhere. Yet the men who had fought there knew that what they had accomplished was no less demanding and no less significant. They had learned to fight a kind of war that few armies in history had mastered. They had sustained multinational cooperation under conditions that tested every alliance. They had turned defeat into victory through a combination of leadership, logistics, and the stubborn refusal of ordinary soldiers to accept that they had been beaten. Those lessons remained relevant long after the last monsoon had passed and the last veteran had returned home. Singh carried those lessons with him as the troopship continued its journey. He thought of the small acts of kindness that had sustained him and the men around him through every phase of the campaign. He thought of the young sepoy he had carried during the retreat, of the Gurkha who had taught him how to move quietly through undergrowth, of the Burmese civilians who had offered water when water was precious. He thought of the letters he had written and the ones he had never been able to finish. The war had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving and keep caring even when fear was constant. It had taught him that victory was not measured only in ground taken or enemies defeated, but in the preservation of human dignity under conditions designed to strip that dignity away. And it had taught him that some of the most important stories of courage are the ones that receive the least attention, the quiet stories of endurance and mutual care that never make the headlines but that allow armies and nations to survive their darkest hours. The legacy of the Burma Campaign lives not only in the official histories and the memoirs of commanders, but in the memories carried by the men who walked those tracks and in the lessons they passed on to those who came after. It lives in the understanding that logistics and health and realistic training can matter as much as courage on the battlefield. It lives in the recognition that multinational forces can achieve remarkable things when leadership treats every soldier as worth preserving. It lives in the reminder that even the most forgotten theaters can produce victories whose strategic and human significance only becomes clear with time. And it lives in the quiet conviction, shared by survivors like Sergeant Rajit Singh, that the true measure of what happened in those green hills is not found in the flags that were raised or lowered, but in the countless individual decisions to keep going, to keep caring, and to refuse to let the worst of war define the best of what it means to be human. The raw, unfiltered reality of those years in the jungle, the faces of the men who endured them, the letters they wrote and the bodies they left behind, lives in photographs and personal accounts that were never meant for ordinary viewing. If you want to see the unvarnished truth of what the soldiers of the Forgotten Army lived through, our exclusive Gumroad digital archive holds rare, uncensored photographs, personal letters, and raw footage from the Burma Campaign jungles that were simply too visceral and restricted for mainstream platforms. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the troopship carried Sergeant Rajit Singh farther from the shores of Burma, he knew that the country and the campaign would remain with him in ways he could not yet fully name. He would return to his family, find work, watch his son grow, and try to build a life that honored the years he had spent carrying a rifle through jungles that most people back home would never see. He would speak sometimes of the friends he had lost and the civilians he had met. He would carry the lessons of leadership and endurance into whatever work he found. And he would understand, in the quiet way that survivors often understand, that the victory he had helped achieve was never only about territory or surrender documents. It was about the preservation of something essential in the face of everything that tried to destroy it. The Burma Campaign had been long, costly, and often overshadowed. Yet for the men who had lived it, and for the generations who would inherit its lessons, it remained a testament to what ordinary human beings can endure and accomplish when they refuse to accept that defeat is final. The green hills had fallen silent, but the stories they held would continue to speak to anyone willing to listen.